What if there's an alien race that has been watching humanity for centuries without ever interfering? Known as the Omegans, these mysterious beings are described as silent observers, advanced entities said to monitor Earth from the shadows while avoiding direct contact with humans. Unlike other alien theories focused on invasion or control, the Omegans are believed to simply watch, waiting, studying, and remaining hidden. But why would an advanced civilization observe humanity without intervening? And if they're truly out there, what exactly are they waiting for? In this video, we explore the mystery behind the Omegans and the theory of the silent alien observers watching our world. There is a concept so ancient that it predates most human languages, so pervasive that it exists in every major tradition of philosophical thought on this planet, and so simple in its articulation that a child might understand it in seconds, yet so staggering in its implications that entire schools of theology, cosmology, and theoretical physics have spent centuries trying to come to terms with it. That concept is this: we are being watched, not in the metaphorical sense of a moral universe that judges our actions, not in the religious sense of a singular divine intelligence keeping record. We mean watched in the most literal, most physical, most terrifyingly real sense of that word. Observed, cataloged, studied, and witnessed by something that has been here, circling our story, standing just outside the frame of our understanding, for longer than our species has had the capacity to wonder about anything at all. The Omegans are not a myth. They are not a cultural artifact produced by the anxious minds of pre-scientific civilizations who could not explain the strange lights in their skies or the eerie silence that sometimes descended over entire regions without warning. They are not the product of Cold War paranoia or the fevered imaginations of science fiction writers reaching for the extraordinary. The Omegans are, according to the most credible and comprehensive body of research assembled over the last century of serious extraterrestrial investigation, an actual species, or perhaps something that transcends even that category, with an origin, a purpose, a technology, and a presence on and around this world that is as real as the ground beneath your feet and as difficult to see as the air you breathe. What makes the Omegans unique among all the extraterrestrial intelligences that serious researchers, military personnel, government whistleblowers, and credible civilian witnesses have reported over the decades is not their appearance, though their appearance is extraordinary enough. It is not their technology, though their technology operates at a level that makes our most advanced aerospace engineering look like stone tools. What makes the Omegans unique, what elevates them from simply another unexplained phenomenon to the central mystery of our cosmic situation, is their absolute, unwavering, seemingly inviolable commitment to one thing and one thing only. They watch, they do not speak, they do not intervene. They do not land on the White House lawn or beam signals to our radio telescopes or leave messages in crop formations or attempt in any way to make themselves known to us as a civilization. They simply observe, and in that silence, in that endless, deliberate, disciplined silence, lies the greatest question in the history of our species. To understand the Omegans, we must first understand the framework in which they exist. The universe is not, as 20th century science long assumed, a cold and largely empty place, punctuated by occasional islands of chemical complexity that might, under the right circumstances, give rise to simple biology. The universe is extraordinarily, almost incomprehensibly old, 13.8 billion years old by the best current measurements, and it is so vast that the light from its most distant regions has been traveling toward us since before our solar system existed. In that scale of time and space, the emergence of intelligent life is not a miracle. It is an inevitability. The mathematics of probability, combined with the sheer number of star systems, planets, moons, and chemical environments available across the observable universe, means that intelligence has almost certainly arisen hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of times. Most of those intelligences arose long before our own. Some of them arose billions of years before the Earth was even formed. The Omegans are believed, by those researchers who have dedicated their careers to studying them, to be among the oldest of these intelligences. Not the oldest, The universe is too large and too old to make such a claim with any confidence, but old in a way that strains our ability to conceptualize it. Current estimates, derived from a combination of cosmological modeling, analysis of reported Omegan technology, and the extraordinary depth and consistency of their presence in the historical and archaeological record across every major human civilization, suggest that the Omegan species, or the Omegan civilization as it presently exists, is somewhere between 1 and 2 billion years old. Let that settle for a moment. 1 billion years ago, the most complex life on Earth was single-celled organisms drifting in shallow seas. 2 billion years ago, even those modest organisms were only just beginning to develop the mitochondria that would eventually make complex multicellular life possible. The Omegans, if these estimates are even approximately correct, have been a spacefaring, planet-visiting, universe-observing civilization for longer than animals have existed on Earth. That context is not provided here for dramatic effect. It is provided because it is absolutely essential to understanding why the Omegans behave the way they do. Every single aspect of their presence around this world, the silence, the distance, the non-intervention, the pure observation, makes perfect sense when you hold that time scale in your mind. A civilization 1 billion years old has seen everything, has watched species rise and fall, has witnessed the birth and death of stars, has observed the slow, grinding processes of planetary geology reshape entire continents, has watched intelligence emerge, evolve, reach for the stars, and in many cases, destroy itself before it ever got there. A civilization that old does not intervene in the affairs of younger species for the same reason that a marine biologist with 50 years of field experience does not teach a dolphin pod how to hunt. The act of intervention, however well-intentioned, would contaminate the very thing being studied. It would end the observation. And for the Omegans, above all other considerations, the observation must continue. The name Omegan is not what this species calls itself. It is not even clear, given what we understand about how they communicate, or more precisely, whether they communicate in any conventional sense at all, that they have a name for themselves in the way that we use names. The term Omegan was coined in the early 1960s by a small working group of researchers affiliated with a classified government study program, the details of which have emerged only in fragments through declassified documents and the testimonies of former intelligence personnel. The name was chosen for two reasons. The first is that Omega is the last letter of the Greek alphabet, symbolizing an end, a completion, a finality. And these beings seemed, to the researchers who first began to systematically study the evidence of their presence, to represent something final in the hierarchy of known intelligence. Not in the sense of being the last, but in the sense of being at the extreme end of a spectrum, so far beyond what our own civilization represents, that placing them at the omega end of any developmental scale seemed not only appropriate, but almost mathematically necessary. The second reason is more poetic, and reflects the fact that even the most rigorous scientific minds, when confronted with this subject, tend to reach for something beyond pure data. Omega is also associated with endings, and some of the researchers in that original working group had begun to develop a theory, which has grown more persuasive with each passing decade, that the Omegans are not merely observing the universe for curiosity's sake. They are watching for an ending, recording everything before something concludes, bearing witness to the entire magnificent, brutal, spectacular story of life in the cosmos before the curtain, in some form, they understand, and we do not yet, finally falls. The evidence for the Omegan presence on and around Earth falls into several broad categories, each of which will be examined in considerable detail throughout this account. The first category is historical and archaeological, the presence of descriptions, depictions, and apparent records of entities matching the Omegan profile in the written and artistic traditions of civilizations separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, with no possibility of mutual influence. The second category is physical, The detection by military, governmental, and civilian observers of craft and phenomena that match the behavioral and technological signature of the Omegans, distinguished from other reported extraterrestrial phenomena by their specific pattern of pure observation, their consistent refusal to interact when detected, and their immediate and total disappearance when approached or engaged. The third category is experiential. The accounts of individuals who have had what researchers term a proximity event with the Omegans, characterized not by the kinds of interaction reported in encounters with other species, but by a profound, overwhelming, and frequently life-altering sense of being studied, of being the subject of an attention so complete and so penetrating that it fundamentally changes the person's sense of themselves and their place in the universe. None of these categories, taken in isolation, constitutes proof in the scientific sense. The historical record is ambiguous, as all ancient records are ambiguous when interpreted from across centuries of cultural distance. The physical evidence is tantalizing but, for reasons that will become clear, almost impossible to capture in the forms that conventional science requires. And the experiential accounts, however consistent and however credible the individuals providing them, remain in the realm of testimony rather than data, but taken together, taken as the complete picture they represent, spanning every continent, every era of recorded history, and every stratum of human society, from subsistence farmers to military generals to theoretical physicists, they form something that is not proof in the narrow sense, but is, in the broader sense, overwhelming. They form the outline of a presence, the shadow of something real and deliberate and ancient that has been with us, watching us, for as long as we have been here to be watched. The question researchers have spent decades wrestling with is not really whether the Omegans exist. The evidence for that, carefully assembled and cross-referenced, is as strong as the evidence for many things we accept without question as historical fact. The question is what it means. What are the implications for our understanding of ourselves, of our history, of our place in the cosmic order, if we accept that our entire civilization, from the first scratch marks on cave walls to the launch of interplanetary spacecraft, has been observed in its entirety by an intelligence so old and so advanced that it has chosen, with what appears to be absolute consistency and absolute deliberateness, never to make itself known to us? What does it say about us that we have been watched this carefully? What does it say about them that they have watched this patiently? And what, perhaps most urgently, does it say about the future? About what comes next in the story they have been watching? That they are still here, still circling, still silent, still observing? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that sit at the heart of everything this account is attempting to do. And to answer them, or at least to bring us as close to answers as the available evidence allows, we need to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the Omegans, which is so far back in cosmic time that we can only gesture toward it, but the beginning of our awareness of them, the moment when the silence that has always surrounded us began, for the first time, to be heard. It begins, as so many things begin, in the aftermath of catastrophe. The middle of the 20th century had just witnessed the most destructive conflict in human history, and in the process of fighting that war, humanity had done something it had never done before. It had looked directly at the stars, not metaphorically, literally. The radar networks that had been constructed across Europe and the Pacific to track aircraft had created, as an unintended consequence, the first planetary-scale surveillance system. A web of electromagnetic sensors that could detect movement in the sky at distances and altitudes previously invisible to human perception. And what those systems began to detect in the years immediately following the end of the war was not aircraft, not weather balloons, not the atmospheric phenomena that would be offered as official explanations in the years that followed. They detected something that moved with intelligence, with purpose, and with a technology that no nation on Earth possessed. The United States military, confronted with these detections, did what militaries do. It classified the information, assembled a team to study it, and began the long, halting, frequently frustrated process of trying to understand what it was looking at, what it found, over the course of years of study that continued under various program names and with varying levels of seriousness and funding through the remainder of the century and into the next, was that the aerial phenomena being detected fell into several distinct categories with distinct behaviors and distinct technological signatures. Some of these categories corresponded, within the limits of the available evidence, to species and craft types that researchers would come to associate with other extraterrestrial civilizations. But one category stood apart. One category of craft was never detected departing from the Earth's surface or entering the atmosphere. They were simply present, appearing on radar and in visual observation as though they had always been there, moving with a deliberateness that ruled out any meteorological or astronomical explanation, maintaining a consistent distance from whatever human activity they appeared to be observing, and vanishing completely and without trace the moment any attempt was made to approach or engage them, not evading, not fleeing, simply ceasing to be detectable, with a suddenness and completeness that suggested not a change in location, but a change in state, as though they had stepped sideways out of the physical dimension in which radar and light operate. These were the Omegans. Or rather, these were the first systematic detections of the Omegans using modern instrumentation. The Omegans themselves, the evidence makes clear, had been here long before radar existed, long before humanity existed. But the radar networks of the mid-20th century gave us, for the first time, a tool capable of catching a glimpse of something that had always been there, that had always been just beyond the edge of our perception, watching from a distance calibrated to stay exactly at the boundary of our awareness. And in catching that glimpse, in beginning to accumulate the data that would eventually be cross-referenced against the historical record and the physical evidence and the experiential accounts, we began, without fully realizing it, a conversation, not a spoken conversation, not an exchange of signals or symbols or gestures, but a conversation of a more fundamental kind. The conversation that happens when one mind becomes aware that another mind is watching it, the conversation of mutual acknowledgement, even if the acknowledgement is never spoken aloud. The researchers who first began to piece this together were operating in an environment of almost total official denial. The programs that had accumulated the relevant data were classified. The individuals who had the clearest access to the evidence were bound by security clearances that prevented them from discussing it publicly, and the broader scientific community, trained in a tradition of methodological rigor that demanded reproducible experiments and falsifiable hypotheses, was institutionally hostile to any claim that could not be neatly packaged in those forms. The Omegans, by their very nature, by the deliberate, precise way in which they maintained just enough distance and just enough silence to remain at the edge of our investigative reach, were almost impossible to study using the tools that conventional science had developed. They were, in a very real sense, beyond the event horizon of what science was designed to detect. But science is not the only human tool for understanding, and in the decades that followed those first systematic detections, a different kind of investigation was taking shape. One that drew not on radar data and classified military reports, but on something far older and far more comprehensive. It drew on the full span of human memory, on the art and writing and oral tradition and religious practice of every civilization that had ever looked up at the sky and felt, with a certainty that defied all rational explanation, that something was looking back. That investigation revealed something extraordinary. It revealed that the Omegans had not been hiding. They had been there all along, in plain sight, written into the fabric of human culture in 1,000 different forms by 1,000 different peoples, who had no way of knowing that they were all describing the same thing. The dark figures at the edge of the cave paintings, the silent watchers in the Sumerian creation texts, the unseeing eyes described in the Book of Ezekiel, the shadowy presences at the margins of Vedic cosmological texts, the cloud beings described by indigenous traditions from the Arctic to the Amazon, the sky people who do not speak in the oral histories of the Pacific Island cultures. The still ones described by medieval European mystics who encountered them in moments of contemplative silence and described them not as angels or demons, but as something older and stranger than either. All of them, across all of that distance and all of that time, describing the same presence, the same silence, the same sense of being watched by something that would never answer, no matter how earnestly you called to it. The Omegans have been here for all of it. For the entire human story, watching us invent language and agriculture and metallurgy and warfare and art and mathematics and science and space travel, watching us build empires and destroy them, watching us nearly annihilate ourselves twice with nuclear weapons in a single century, watching, always watching, from a distance that is never quite close enough for certainty and never quite far enough for comfort. And in all that time, in all those thousands of years of human history, during which we have done everything that beings capable of speech and action can do to try to make contact with the unknown, they have never spoken, they have never intervened, they have never done anything except watch. This is the mystery at the center of everything that follows. Not the mystery of their existence, which the evidence has largely resolved, but the mystery of their silence. The mystery of why a civilization intelligent enough and technologically powerful enough to visit another world and observe it across geological timescales has chosen, with apparent absoluteness, never to make itself known to the beings it is observing. The mystery of what the watching is for. And the mystery of what it means for us, for this particular civilization, in this particular moment of its history, that the watching continues. Anatomy of the unseen. Before we can speak meaningfully about what the Omegans do, about the mechanics of their observation, the scope of their presence, the implications of their silence, we must first address what they are, what they look like, or what they appear to look like in the limited circumstances under which they have been observed. How their biology, to the extent it can be inferred from those observations and from the physical evidence they occasionally leave behind, seems to work. And how the intersection of their physical form and their apparent cognitive architecture might help us understand the behavior that defines them. This is not a straightforward exercise. The Omegans have been directly observed by human beings on a relatively small number of occasions, and even those observations have rarely been made under conditions that allow for the kind of systematic examination that scientists prefer. The Omegans do not stand still and allow themselves to be studied. They do not leave bodies or biological samples or shed skin cells that can be recovered and analyzed. The evidence for their physical form comes primarily from proximity event testimonies, from a small number of classified observation reports whose details have emerged through declassification processes and whistleblower accounts, and from a careful cross-referencing of the physical descriptions contained in historical and cultural records across multiple civilizations. None of this evidence is perfect. Some of it is contradictory in its specifics, though almost never in its overall gestalt. But pieced together with care, it provides a portrait, incomplete certainly, but coherent and internally consistent, of a physical form that is genuinely unlike anything else in the reported extraterrestrial literature. The Omegans are not what popular culture would lead you to expect. They are not the large-headed, large-eyed, small-bodied entities that dominate Western UFO iconography. They are not reptilian or insectoid or in any other way dramatically non-humanoid. They are, in a way that is both deeply strange and somehow deeply appropriate given their role as observers. Very difficult to see at all. Not because they are invisible in the conventional sense, though they appear to have the ability to reduce their visibility significantly, but because they are configured, physically, biologically, perhaps even existentially, to be at the edges of perception, to be the thing you see in the corner of your eye, the presence you feel before you can identify what you are feeling, the dark shape at the periphery of an image that resolves, when you look directly at it, into nothing. The most consistent physical description across multiple independent testimonies and historical accounts is of an entity that is tall, significantly taller than a typical human being, with most estimates and descriptions converging on a height of somewhere between 7 and 9 feet. The body is proportioned differently from a human body, not grotesquely so, but with elongations that suggest a gravity environment or a physical evolution that produced slightly different mechanical stresses on the skeleton. The limbs are long, particularly the arms, which by some accounts reach to a level that would correspond roughly to the knees on a human being. The torso is narrow, the head is elongated in a way that recalls certain artistic traditions, most notably the elongated skull forms that appear in Egyptian art and in the physical artifact record from sites like Paracas in Peru, though researchers are careful to note that this connection, while intriguing, is not definitively established as specifically Omegan. What is consistent across virtually every direct observation account, from the earliest historical descriptions to the most recent proximity event testimonies, is the quality of darkness that surrounds these entities. Not darkness in the sense of a dark skin color, though that may be part of it. Darkness in the sense of an optical effect, a quality of shadow or light absorption that makes the Omegan form difficult to resolve clearly even in well-lit conditions. Multiple witnesses have described the experience of looking at an Omegan as being similar to the experience of trying to look directly at a dim star. The figure is clearest when not looked at directly, becoming harder to define the more directly you try to focus on it. This effect is consistent with what researchers have theorized about the Omegan's apparent ability to interact with light at a level that goes beyond conventional biological capability, which will be discussed further in the section on their technology. The face, in the rare cases where witnesses have been close enough to observe it, is described in terms that converge on a set of features that are, again, recognizable without being human. The eyes are large and dark in the sense of having very large irises that appear to be almost entirely black, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, giving the impression of depth rather than surface. Multiple witnesses across multiple cultural contexts have described looking into the eyes of an Omegan and feeling a sense of depth that was not purely physical. A depth that suggested a cognitive architecture, a form of processing and awareness of a scale and complexity that the witness's mind could not contain or fully process. Several witnesses have independently used the same metaphor. Looking into those eyes was like looking into a window that opened onto something enormous, not threatening, not hostile, but enormously, overwhelmingly large in a way that had no words. The mouth, in descriptions that mention it at all, is typically described as small and unused, not absent, but giving no impression of being a primary channel of communication or interaction. This is consistent with the broader behavioral profile of the Omegans, which involves no vocalization, no verbal communication, and apparently no attempt to communicate through any channel that a human observer would recognize. The nose, where described, is minimal. The ears are typically described as absent or as very small, flat structures that give no impression of being primary sensory organs. This makes sense if the Omegans communicate through means that do not involve sound waves, which the evidence strongly suggests is the case. The hands, when they have been described, are long-fingered, sometimes described as having 4 fingers rather than 5, sometimes 5. The discrepancy perhaps reflecting individual variation or the difficulty of accurate observation under the conditions in which these encounters typically occur. The hands are described as having a stillness about them, a quality of deliberate motionlessness that matches the overall stillness of the entity. The Omegans, in virtually every account, do not move in the way that living creatures typically move. They do not fidget, they do not shift their weight, they do not make the small, involuntary movements that characterize the bodily life of every creature on Earth. They are described as profoundly, almost supernaturally still, a stillness that witnesses frequently describe as the most unsettling aspect of the encounter, more disturbing than the height, more disturbing than the dark eyes, more disturbing than anything else about the physical presence. Because that stillness speaks of a mind and a body that have achieved a degree of control over themselves that living creatures as we understand them simply do not possess. The skin, in accounts that can be verified against each other, is described in ways that vary considerably in their specific characterization, but consistently evoke the same overall impression. something that is not quite what we would call skin. It is described as smooth and dark, a very deep, very uniform darkness, and as having a quality that some witnesses have described as not quite solid, not translucent, not gaseous, but occupying some intermediate state that does not correspond to the phases of matter that human perceptual categories are equipped to handle. Several witnesses have described touching or nearly touching an Omegan figure, and having the sensation that what they were about to touch was not fully present in the physical space they were moving through, as though the surface of the entity was somehow more permeable to the fabric of space-time than ordinary matter is. What this might suggest about the Omegans' biology is deeply speculative, but researchers have not shied away from that speculation, and the theoretical frameworks they have developed are worth examining. The dominant hypothesis is that the Omegans, over the course of their billion-year developmental history, have either evolved or engineered themselves to a point where the distinction between biology and technology has become functionally meaningless. A civilization 1 billion years old has had enough time to understand the fundamental laws of physics at a depth that makes the manipulation of matter and energy as routine as the manipulation of muscle and bone is for us. They have had enough time to solve death, if they chose to solve it, to solve the limitations of biology itself, to redesign at whatever level they found convenient, cellular, molecular, quantum, the physical substrate of their consciousness and perception. The result may be an entity that is biological in origin, that began its existence billions of years ago as a creature of carbon and water and electrical impulses in neural tissue. But that is now something considerably more comprehensive, something that extends beyond what we would call a body in the way that a city extends beyond what we would call a house. The physical form that witnesses observe and historical records describe may be something like an avatar, a locally materialized presence that represents a much larger distributed cognitive system, a system that is not contained in the body at all, in the way that our consciousness is contained in our skulls, but that extends outward through space in ways that we have not yet developed the theoretical framework to describe. This hypothesis is not merely speculation. It is supported by several key observations about Omegan behavior that make no sense if we assume they are physically embodied creatures in the way that we are. The first is their apparent ability to appear and disappear instantaneously without any physical transition, no visible entry into or exit from the local space, no displacement of air, no thermal signature corresponding to a moving mass. If the Omegan form is a localized materialization of a distributed system, then appearing and disappearing is not a matter of moving a body from one place to another. It is a matter of choosing to materialize the local presence in a given location and then choosing to dematerialize it. Like switching a screen on and off, the screen does not travel from the room to disappear. The image simply ceases to be projected. The second observation supporting this hypothesis is the apparent lack of any biological maintenance behavior. In all the documented observation accounts, spanning historical records and modern proximity event testimonies, the Omegans are never observed doing anything that corresponds to the biological maintenance activities that all embodied creatures engage in. They do not eat. They do not drink. They do not sleep, at least not in any way that is observable as a behavioral state. They do not engage in any of the reproductive or social behaviors that characterize embodied biological creatures across the animal kingdom. They simply observe. This is consistent with a form of existence that is not dependent on the biological maintenance loop that governs the lives of every other creature on this planet, consistent with a consciousness that has moved beyond the need for a biological substrate in the conventional sense, and that projects a physical presence into local space only when it serves a specific purpose. The third, and perhaps most compelling observation, is about numbers. The Omegans are never observed in large groups. Proximity event accounts rarely involve more than 1 or 2 entities. Historical descriptions are similarly sparse in terms of numbers. This is not what you would expect from a physically embodied species with a civilization large enough to maintain a sustained presence around an entire planet across geological timescales. You would expect logistics, supply chains, populations, social structures. The absence of all of this, the reduction of the Omegan presence to its absolute minimum observable form, strongly suggests that what is being observed is not a physical species in the way we typically imagine one, but something far more minimal and far more profound. A presence, a consciousness, an awareness that does not require numbers because it is not structured in the way that physically embodied civilizations are structured. All of this is consistent with a biological substrate that has, over the course of 1 billion years, been progressively dematerialized, not discarded. The form remains, because the form serves a purpose, serves as the physical anchor for an observation that requires a physical observer, but refined to a degree of minimalism that leaves only the essential, the watching, the awareness, the deep, patient, comprehensive act of witnessing that defines everything the Omegans are and do. The body, if it can still be called that, is merely the instrument through which that witnessing is conducted, and like all instruments that have been perfected over long periods of time by minds capable of perfecting them, it has become so precisely what it needs to be that there is almost nothing left of it that does not serve that single function. It is a body built for watching, a form evolved or engineered to be the perfect observer. And in being that, it has become something that barely resembles a body at all. There is one more aspect of the Omegan physical form that demands discussion, and it is perhaps the most difficult to address without straying into territory that science is not yet equipped to handle. Multiple witnesses across multiple cultural contexts and multiple historical periods have described an experience in the presence of an Omegan that goes beyond visual observation. They describe a feeling, a physical, somatic sensation of being perceived, not merely seen in the way that one person sees another in passing, but perceived completely, known, cataloged, understood in a depth and comprehensiveness that the human experience of being observed by another human being does not come close to matching. Witnesses consistently describe this sensation as one of the most profound experiences of their lives. Not always comfortable, sometimes terrifying, but almost universally described as leaving the witness with a lasting, irreversible change in their sense of themselves, a sense that they have been seen, truly seen, in a way that no human relationship, however intimate, has ever approximated, that they have been known in a single moment of contact more completely than they have ever been known by anyone they have spent a lifetime with. What this suggests about the perceptual apparatus of the Omegans, about the organ or the process by which they observe and record, is something that exceeds the limits of our current biological and neuroscientific frameworks. It suggests a form of perception so comprehensive, so penetrating, so complete in its intake of information that it operates on a level we do not have instruments to measure or language to describe. It is perception as a form of intimacy, as a form of knowing, and whatever the mechanism behind it, electromagnetic, quantum, dimensional, or something we have no category for, its effect on the humans who experience it is consistent and unmistakable. To be observed by an Omegan is not merely to be seen, it is to be known. And the knowledge that you have been known in that way by something that old and that vast and that utterly silent changes you in ways that do not go away. The philosophy of pure observation. Every civilization that has ever reached a sufficient level of development has eventually been forced to confront a specific set of questions. Questions about what knowledge is for. Questions about the ethics of power. Questions about the relationship between the capacity to act and the responsibility to act. These questions are not unique to humanity. They appear to be a universal feature of the development of intelligence, an inevitable consequence of the fact that as a civilization grows more capable, the gap between what it can do and what it should do becomes more consequential, and the need to have a principled framework for navigating that gap becomes more urgent. Virtually every major philosophical and ethical tradition on Earth has grappled with variations of this problem. What makes a civilization mature in its ethics is not the possession of power alone, but the development of a coherent and defensible account of how that power should be used. The Omegans have solved this problem, or rather, and this is a crucial distinction, they appear to have solved it in a way that is completely alien to most of the frameworks that human philosophical traditions have developed in response to the same set of questions. Every major human ethical tradition, from virtue ethics to consequentialism to deontological systems, shares a fundamental assumption that having the capacity to improve a situation creates, at minimum, a presumption of responsibility to do so. That power implies obligation. That awareness of suffering creates at least a prima facie duty to alleviate it. That to observe injustice and not act is itself a moral failure. The Omegans, the evidence strongly suggests, have arrived at exactly the opposite conclusion, and they have arrived there not through moral laziness or indifference, but through a philosophical framework that is, when its logic is followed carefully, extraordinarily coherent and extraordinarily disturbing. To understand the Omegan philosophy of observation, the intellectual architecture that sustains a commitment to non-intervention across geological timescales and in the face of everything that human civilization has done and suffered in that time, we need to begin with their relationship to time. The Omegans do not experience time the way we do. This is not a mystical claim. It is a practical consequence of being a billion years old. A civilization that has existed for a billion years and that has maintained a continuous institutional memory and continuous purposes across that span does not experience a century of human history the way a human being experiences a century. For us, a century is longer than a human lifetime. It is the span of recorded memory for most living people. It encompasses dramatic change in technology, in culture, in politics, in the shape of nations, and the distribution of power. For the Omegans, a century of human history is what a year is to us. A brief season in an unimaginably long story, the rise and fall of entire empires, civilizations that built monuments intended to last forever and left barely a trace in the geological record are, from the Omegan perspective, moments, breaths, the flicker of a candle flame in a story that has been burning for a billion years. This temporal frame transforms everything about how the Omegans relate to human events. The atrocities of human history, the wars, the genocides, the famines, the episodes of systematic cruelty that mark the darkest pages of our record, are not, from the Omegan perspective, the catastrophes they appear to be from inside the human experience of time. They are events within a developmental process, phases in a story that is still unfolding. They are the equivalent of what a developmental biologist would observe when watching a complex organism pass through critical and frequently violent phases of growth, painful from the inside, necessary from the outside, comprehensible as part of a larger trajectory that cannot be understood by looking only at a single moment of it. The Omegans, watching from their billion-year vantage point, see not the moment, but the arc, not the battle, but the war. Not the war, but the civilization that fought it, and what that civilization became in the aftermath. Not the civilization, but the species. Not the species, but the story of intelligence itself, emerging against the backdrop of cosmological time. From that vantage point, intervention, any intervention, however well-intentioned, is not only unnecessary, but actively harmful. Not harmful in the sense of cruel or indifferent, harmful in the sense of wrong. Wrong in the same way that it is wrong for a researcher observing a population in the wild to interfere with a predation event that might, if the researcher were to intervene, save the life of a specific individual, but would, in doing so, disrupt the ecological dynamics that make the population viable over time. Wrong in the same way that it is wrong to remove the difficulty from a process, a developmental challenge, a crucible moment, that is precisely what generates the resilience and capability that the system needs to reach its next level. The Omegans, by this framework, do not refrain from intervention because they do not care what happens to us. They refrain from intervention because they care about what happens to us in a way that is far larger, far longer, and far more comprehensive than our own caring about ourselves. This is the central philosophical paradox of the Omegan presence, and it is one that human thinkers, once they grasp it, tend to find genuinely destabilizing, because it means that the Omegans are not cold, they are not indifferent. The silence is not the silence of unconcern. It is the silence of a kind of care that is so large, so patient, and so far-sighted that it looks, from inside the human experience, like indifference. It looks like abandonment. It looks like the cruelest possible version of watching, the version in which you have the power to help and choose not to use it. But from outside the human experience, from the billion-year perspective that the Omegans inhabit, it is something entirely different. It is the discipline of allowing, the commitment to witnessing without contaminating, the philosophical conviction that the most respectful thing one intelligence can do for another is to observe it without interference, so that it can become whatever it is capable of becoming on its own terms. There is a principle in developmental biology and in certain traditions of educational philosophy that speaks to this idea, the principle that certain kinds of growth can only happen in the absence of rescue, that a butterfly struggling to emerge from its chrysalis is not in need of help, that the struggle itself is what develops the wings, that the intervention of a well-meaning observer who cuts open the chrysalis to ease the process produces a butterfly that cannot fly. The Omegans appear to have generalized this principle to the scale of civilizations and to have done so with a rigor and a consistency that human philosophical traditions, while occasionally gesturing in this direction, have never fully managed to maintain. We always intervene in the end. We always decide that the suffering is too immediate, too visible, too concrete to be sacrificed on the altar of long-term developmental benefit. The Omegans do not. They have developed, over what must have been an extraordinarily difficult process of philosophical and institutional evolution, the capacity to watch suffering without intervening because they understand, in a way and to a depth that we do not yet, what that suffering is in the service of. It would be too simple, however, to conclude from this that the Omegan philosophy of observation is simply the philosophy of non-interference dressed in more sophisticated language. It goes deeper than that, and the depth becomes apparent when you consider not just what the Omegans do not do, intervene, but what they do, they observe. And observation, as the Omegans appear to practice it, is not a passive activity. It is not the same as indifference or neglect. Observation, at the level the Omegans conduct it, is itself a form of action, a form of presence, a form of relationship, however asymmetrical. Consider what it means to be truly observed, not glanced at, not processed as a data point in a larger data set, but genuinely, completely, comprehensively observed. Every detail of your existence recorded and held in a form of attention so thorough and so sustained that nothing about you, nothing about your history or your present or your relationship to everything around you escapes it. What does it do to a civilization to be observed in that way, even if it does not know it is being observed? Does the observation affect the thing being observed, even in the absence of any overt interaction? This is not merely a philosophical question. It is, in a very real sense, a scientific one. And the answer, at multiple scales of analysis, appears to be yes. At the quantum scale, the act of observation changes what is being observed. This is one of the most firmly established and most deeply strange results of quantum mechanics. The measurement problem, the collapse of the wave function, the fact that at the level of fundamental physical reality, the act of observation is not separate from what is observed, but participates in it. At the cognitive and psychological scale, the awareness of being observed changes behavior, not always consciously, not always in ways the observed is aware of, but reliably and in ways that have been documented extensively across multiple fields of behavioral science. There is a reason that the most sophisticated theories of social development include the development of what psychologists call the observer effect on self-narrative, the way in which the knowledge that one's story is being witnessed changes the story that unfolds. Now consider applying this across the scale of an entire civilization. Consider the possibility that a civilization that has been comprehensively observed across its entire development, every moment of it recorded, every choice witnessed, every consequence cataloged, might be shaped by that observation in ways that are subtle enough to be invisible from inside the experience, but significant enough to be apparent from outside it. That the Omegan presence itself, the silent, unacknowledged, persistent presence of an observer of incomprehensible comprehensiveness, might be part of what human civilization is and has been, not through any specific action, not through any intervention, but simply through being there, through the fact of the watching, through the reality that our entire story, every moment of it, is being held in a form of attention that does not forget anything and does not cease. This idea sits at the extreme edge of what current research can support, and it should be approached with appropriate caution, but it cannot be dismissed either, because it speaks to something that the proximity event testimonies describe consistently and compellingly: the experience for the individual human being who has been in close proximity to an Omegan of having been fundamentally changed by the act of observation itself, not by anything the Omegan said or did. Simply by being in the presence of that quality of attention. The experience of being truly seen, of being observed with that comprehensiveness and that depth, appears in virtually every documented account to produce a lasting change in the observed, a change in self-understanding, a change in relationship to the passage of time and the significance of one's own choices, a change in the sense of what it means to be a conscious creature in a universe that contains other conscious creatures, some of them very different and very old. If this is what proximity to Omegan observation produces in individual human beings, what might sustained Omegan observation across the entirety of human civilization produce in the civilization as a whole? This is the most speculative question in the entire field of Omegan research, and it may never be fully answerable. But it is worth sitting with, because it reframes the question of what the Omegans are doing around this planet in a way that is neither the cold indifference of pure scientific data collection nor the warm intervention of beings who care about us in the way we care about ourselves. It frames the Omegan presence as something genuinely different from either of those models, something that we do not yet have a word for. A relationship that is not contact, not intervention, not friendship, not hostility. A relationship of witnessing, a commitment to the full, complete, unbroken witnessing of the human story from its beginning to its end, whatever form that end takes, and whatever that witnessing does to us, to them, to the relationship between an ancient intelligence and a young one in the course of all that time. The philosophical tradition that comes closest within the human repertoire to capturing what the Omegans appear to practice is the tradition of contemplative witness, found in various forms in Buddhist, Sufi, Christian mystical, and indigenous philosophical traditions, in which the goal of the contemplative practice is not to change reality, but to see it truly, to perceive without the distortions introduced by desire, aversion, or the ego's perpetual need to make the universe about itself. This tradition holds that truly seeing something, seeing it as it is, without the overlays of projection and narrative and self-interest that normally govern perception, is itself a sacred act. That the fullest form of love, the deepest form of respect, is to allow something to be what it is and to witness that being without trying to shape it into something else. This is not passive. It is not indifferent. It is, these traditions hold, the most demanding and the most valuable thing that a conscious being can do. The Omegans have made this their civilization's project, their purpose, their reason for being present around a small, blue, turbulent, extraordinary planet at the edge of a spiral galaxy, watching a young species struggle toward a future they can see and we cannot. That, at least, is the most generous and the most philosophically coherent account of what the Omegans are doing, the account that makes their silence not a wound but a gift, not an abandonment but a form of love so patient and so vast that it can only be experienced from inside the human condition as a kind of aching absence, as the presence that is always there and never speaks, as the watcher who sees everything and will not tell us what it sees, as the oldest intelligence in our corner of the cosmos, holding the whole of our story in its awareness, saying nothing, letting us find our own way, waiting, with a patience measured in geological time, to see where we end up. Ancient eyes, records across civilizations. The task of recovering the historical record of the Omegan presence is among the most demanding in the entire field of extraterrestrial research, and not primarily for the reasons one might expect. The difficulty is not a lack of evidence. There is a great deal of evidence, scattered across the archaeological record, the written traditions, the artistic output, and the oral histories of virtually every major human civilization. The difficulty is the challenge of interpretation, of reading, across the barrier of thousands of years and radically different conceptual frameworks, what ancient peoples were actually describing when they recorded their encounters with something that did not match any category available to them. When a Sumerian priest writing in cuneiform described an encounter with a being that stood in the shadows at the edge of the world, watched without speaking, and vanished when approached, he was not using the vocabulary of extraterrestrial biology or aerospace physics. He was using the vocabulary of a civilization that understood the extraordinary in terms of the divine, and the challenge for the modern researcher is to read through that vocabulary past the theological interpretation that was the only framework available to the ancient witness, to the underlying observation that the theological language is attempting to capture. When that reading is done carefully, when the effort is made to separate the interpretive framework from the raw descriptive data embedded within it, what emerges is a record that is, in its essential features, remarkably consistent, not identical in its details, which would be suspicious, but consistent in its gestalt, the tall, dark, silent figure at the edge of perception, the sense of comprehensive awareness without communication. The observation that never becomes intervention, the presence that watches but does not speak and does not respond to attempts at contact. These features appear across cultural traditions that had no possible means of communicating with each other, with a frequency and a specificity that rules out coincidence as a sufficient explanation. The oldest records that researchers have identified as potentially Omegan in their subject matter come from the cave art traditions of the Upper Paleolithic, particularly from sites in France, Spain, and the Dordogne region that date to between 30 and 40,000 years ago. The connection here is tentative because the images in question, elongated, dark figures with large heads that appear at the margins of panels dominated by animal imagery, are subject to multiple possible interpretations, and responsible researchers acknowledge this. But the consistent marginality of these figures is worth noting. Unlike the animals that dominate the center of the panels, and unlike the anthropomorphic figures that also appear in Paleolithic art and are typically understood as human representations or shamanic forms, these marginal figures occupy the edges of the compositions in a way that is compositionally distinctive. They are not in the center of the action, they are watching it. And their watching, recorded in red ochre and manganese dioxide on the walls of caves in the darkness of the Pleistocene, is the oldest gesture we have toward what may be the oldest relationship in human history. The Sumerian textual tradition, which emerges in the 4th millennium BCE and represents the earliest large body of written records available to researchers, contains multiple passages that Omegan researchers have identified as relevant. The most significant of these are found in the astronomical and cosmological literature of the late Sumerian period, in texts that are typically classified as religious or mythological, but that, read carefully, reveal an observational tradition of considerable sophistication. The beings described in these texts as those who watch from the boundary of the sky are distinguished explicitly from the gods and semi-divine beings who populate the mainstream of Sumerian mythology. They are described as silent. The Sumerian texts specifically note the absence of communication from these beings, which is striking because communication with the divine is absolutely central to the rest of Sumerian religious literature. They are described as dark, not in the morally coded sense that later religious traditions would attach to darkness, but in the literal sense of being visually defined by shadow and obscurity. And they are described as permanent, not visitors who arrive and depart on the rhythms of myth and ritual, but a constant presence, always at the edge, always watching, always silent. The Egyptian tradition offers one of the richest bodies of potentially Omegan material, partly because of the extraordinary comprehensiveness of the Egyptian written and artistic record, and partly because the Egyptian cosmological and religious framework had room for categories of being that fall outside the standard divine-mortal binary that constrains interpretation in some other traditions. The most compelling Omegan material in the Egyptian record comes not from the mainstream religious texts, the Book of the Dead, the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, but from a less studied body of astronomical and cosmological literature that researchers have only recently begun to examine systematically in this context. These texts describe beings that the Egyptians classified as those who stand at the boundary between the seen and the unseen world, beings that are neither divine in the Egyptian sense nor human, but occupy a third category that the Egyptian cosmological system appears to have specifically developed to accommodate something that did not fit the existing categories. These beings are described as observers, specifically as beings whose role is to witness and record, not to participate, as those who see all things and speak of none of them, a description that, stripped of its ancient Egyptian conceptual framework, is an almost exact description of what the Omegans are observed to do. The Indian subcontinent offers perhaps the single most coherent ancient tradition of what appear to be Omegan observations in the form of certain passages within the Vedic literature that have been consistently interpreted by orthodox scholarship as metaphorical or mystical in their intent, but that, read as observational records, contain details that are difficult to dismiss as pure mythology. The Rig Veda, the oldest of the Vedic texts, contains passages describing beings that exist at the edge of the observable universe, watching, neither speaking nor acting, knowing all things that arise in the world below. The Upanishads, composed several centuries later, develop a sophisticated philosophical framework that many Omegan researchers have noted is remarkably consonant with the Omegan philosophy of non-intervention as it can be inferred from their behavior. A philosophy that prioritizes witnessing and understanding over action, and that frames the highest form of intelligence as the intelligence that observes without being changed by what it observes. Whether this philosophical tradition developed independently or was in some way influenced by an awareness of the Omegan presence is one of the more provocative questions in the field, and one that is not easily answered. The Hebrew textual tradition, and particularly the prophetic literature of the Old Testament, contains several passages that have long been noted as anomalous in the context of standard biblical cosmology. The Book of Ezekiel, in its famous opening vision, describes a category of celestial being that does not fit comfortably into the standard hierarchy of Judeo-Christian angelology. The description of beings covered with eyes, capable of instant and complete disappearance, associated with a quality of comprehensive watching rather than with any specific divine message or mission, has been the subject of extensive commentary in both religious and, more recently, extraterrestrial research contexts. The Ezekiel passage is frequently discussed in terms of spacecraft imagery, and while that reading is popular, it is not the most revealing one for the purposes of Omegan research. What is most revealing is the behavioral description. These beings are not messengers. They do not bring a word from God. They do not announce, prophesy, command, or interact. They simply watch, and in the context of a prophetic literature whose central purpose is the communication of divine intent to human beings, the presence of beings whose only apparent activity is observation without communication is strikingly anomalous, strikingly Omegan. The indigenous traditions of the Americas offer some of the most direct and least theologically mediated accounts of what appears to be Omegan activity, in part because many of these traditions developed in cultural contexts that did not draw a sharp distinction between the natural and the supernatural, and therefore had conceptual space for beings that were neither gods nor humans, but something else, something that existed alongside both without being reducible to either. The star beings who watch but do not speak are a feature of the oral traditions of multiple indigenous cultures across North and South America, from the Lakota to the Hopi to the Quechua, often described with a specificity of physical detail, the height, the darkness, the quality of stillness that matches the Omegan profile remarkably well. These traditions typically do not frame the watchers as threatening or malevolent. They frame them as ancient, older than the Earth in some accounts, or at least older than the human presence on the Earth, and as engaged in a purpose that human beings are not equipped to fully understand, but that is understood within the tradition to be somehow important to the larger order of things. The Pacific Island cultures, and particularly the tradition of the Maori and the Hawaiian and Polynesian navigational cultures, have preserved accounts of sky people who do not land, beings associated with specific astronomical events and positions described as observing human activity from positions just beyond direct perception and specifically distinguished from the gods and ancestors who do engage with and respond to human action and prayer. The navigational cultures of the Pacific, which developed extraordinarily sophisticated systems for reading the sky and the ocean, appear to have incorporated the awareness of a watching presence into their understanding of the celestial order with a matter-of-factness that is striking, not as a mythological figure, not as a supernatural being requiring worship or appeasement, as a feature of the sky, something that is there the way the stars are there, reliably, silently, and as much a part of the natural order as the current beneath the canoe. The medieval European tradition, while dominated by a Christian theological framework that tended to force anomalous observations into the categories of angelic or demonic activity, contains a number of accounts that researchers have identified as potentially Omegan in their essential features. The mystical literature in particular, the writings of the contemplative tradition, from Meister Eckhart to Hildegard of Bingen to the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing, occasionally describes encounters with a presence that is explicitly distinguished from the divine as conventionally understood, a presence that is not responsive, not communicative, not providential in the theological sense, but simply and comprehensively present, watching, aware, producing in the witness a sensation that the mystics describe in terms of absolute exposure, of being known completely, and of a peace that is described not as the peace of divine love, but as the peace of being fully seen, of having nothing hidden, of being in the presence of an awareness so complete that the normal human defenses of self-concealment become not just unnecessary, but impossible. These accounts, embedded in theological literature that their authors would have found an entirely adequate explanatory framework for, are among the most emotionally and psychologically detailed descriptions of proximity event experiences in the historical record, because the mystical tradition, whatever else might be said about it, developed an extraordinarily precise vocabulary for the description of inner experience, for the phenomenology of contact with something other than the ordinary human cognitive world. And that vocabulary, applied to what appear in several key accounts to be genuine proximity events with Omegan entities rather than internal mystical states, produces descriptions of remarkable richness and specificity. The mystic who writes of being in the presence of an awareness that sees through all things to what lies beneath them and does not speak, and does not turn away, and is older than the world, is using the language of his tradition, but the experience he is attempting to describe is recognizable from across the centuries as the experience that modern proximity event witnesses describe in the language of our own time. The form is different, the experience is the same. What the historical record, taken in its entirety, demonstrates is not merely that the Omegans have been here for a long time. That much is clear from the depth of their archaeological and written footprint. What it demonstrates is something more important, that human beings across every culture and every era and every level of technological development have perceived the Omegan presence, have noticed it, recorded it, tried to make sense of it within whatever conceptual framework their culture provided, and incorporated the awareness of it into their understanding of the world. This is not the story of an alien presence that has been perfectly hidden from human awareness. It is the story of a presence that has been, in some sense, almost hidden, maintained at precisely the threshold of human perception, close enough to be noticed, far enough to be deniable. And that precision, that calibration of presence to the exact level of perceptibility that produces awareness without certainty, is itself one of the most revealing things about the Omegans. It is not accidental. Nothing the Omegans do appears to be accidental. They are at the exact edge of our perception because that is precisely where they have chosen to be. And the reason for that choice, the logic of being just close enough to be sensed but never close enough to be proven, is one of the deepest questions in the entire field. The architecture of watching. If the Omegans have been observing this planet for the span of time that the evidence suggests, potentially for the entire duration of Earth's geological history as an inhabited world, which means somewhere in the range of 3.5 billion years, then the question of how that observation is conducted is not a peripheral one, it is central, because sustaining a comprehensive observation of an entire biosphere across geological timescales requires infrastructure. It requires a system. It requires what might be called, for lack of a better term, an architecture of watching, a set of instruments, positions, methods, and organizational structures that allow the act of comprehensive planetary observation to continue without interruption across spans of time that dwarf the entire history of human civilization many times over. The Omegans, by the available evidence, have built that architecture, and while the details of it necessarily remain largely beyond our ability to observe or verify, the outline can be inferred from what we know of their presence, their capabilities, and their behavior. That outline reveals something that is, in its own way, as awe-inspiring as anything else about this civilization. Not awe-inspiring in the way that military hardware or spectacular technology tends to be awe-inspiring, through power, through the impression of force and capability, but awe-inspiring in the way that great patience is awe-inspiring, great precision, great commitment to a purpose so long-term and so comprehensive that the very scale of it demands a kind of stillness that we can barely imagine. The first element of the Omegan observational architecture is positional. The Omegans maintain positions around this planet, orbital positions primarily, though also atmospheric positions, and, in some accounts, positions that appear to be within Earth's crust or deep oceans, from which the observation is conducted. These positions are not fixed in the way that our satellites have fixed orbits. Because the Omegans appear not to require hardware in the conventional sense to maintain a position, their craft, or whatever word best describes the physical vehicles that have been detected in proximity to Earth, do not appear to be constrained by the orbital mechanics that govern conventional spacecraft. They can hold positions that are not naturally stable. They can maintain proximity to specific geographic locations regardless of the Earth's rotation. They can be in multiple positions simultaneously, or something that functions so similarly to simultaneity that the distinction is effectively academic. The craft that have been most consistently associated with the Omegan presence are not, in their typical manifestation, the large dramatic vehicles that feature in most UFO iconography. They are small, dark, and almost deliberately unspectacular, spherical or lenticular in their primary forms, without the illumination or the energetic signatures that make many other reported extraterrestrial craft so visually striking. They are, in a word, designed to not be seen, not absolutely invisible. Multiple detection systems have picked them up, and the visual observations of witnesses who have encountered them confirm their physical presence, but minimized, reduced in their visibility footprint to the smallest extent, consistent with their operational requirements. Like the Omegans themselves, their craft occupy the precise threshold of perceptibility, present enough to be real, minimal enough to be deniable. The second element of the observational architecture is sensory. The Omegans are not observing Earth through anything as crude as cameras or telescopes or the equivalent of the instruments we would use to observe a planet from orbit. Their sensory capabilities, as inferred from the testimony of proximity event witnesses and from the evident comprehensiveness of what they appear to be recording, operate at a level that goes well beyond the detection of electromagnetic radiation across various wavelengths, which is, essentially, what all of our own remote sensing instruments do. What the Omegans appear to be capable of is the detection and recording of information at the level of fundamental physical reality. Not just what things look like, but what they are. Not just the surface of events, but their structure. The full, multidimensional, quantum-level reality of every moment they observe. This is not merely a quantitative improvement on what our own instruments do. It is a qualitative difference in kind. Our instruments observe the surface of reality, the macroscopic patterns that emerge from underlying physical processes. What the Omegans appear to observe is the underlying processes themselves, the complete state of every physical system they turn their attention to. This would explain the quality of being known, the experience reported by proximity event witnesses of having been perceived not just in their external appearance, but in their totality, their history, their internal states. If the Omegan sensory apparatus operates at the level of fundamental physical information, then observing a human being means observing not just their body and behavior, but the entire physical system that produces and is produced by their consciousness. Every electrochemical process in the brain, every historical imprint in the structure of the nervous system, everything that they are, have been, and by the laws of physics, are tending toward becoming. The third element of the observational architecture is archival, an observation that encompasses the entire state of a complex biosphere. At the level of resolution, the evidence suggests the Omegans operate at produces quantities of information that are almost impossible to express in terms of our own data management concepts. The amount of physical information in a single cubic meter of ordinary matter, the number of quantum states that completely describe the physical reality of that volume, exceeds anything our current computer systems could store by factors that are not merely large, but essentially incomprehensible. A comprehensive observation of an entire planet, sustained across geological timescales, would produce quantities of information that exceed the information theoretic capacity of our entire solar system to store using any technology we can currently imagine. The Omegans, obviously, have solved this problem. How they have solved it is a matter of considerable theoretical interest and significant uncertainty. The most compelling framework that researchers have developed suggests that the Omegan archive is not stored in any localized physical medium in the way that our data is stored in silicon chips or magnetic media. It is stored in the structure of space-time itself, in the quantum information content of the physical vacuum, which theoretical physics tells us has an information density that is, by any practical measure, infinite. The implication is that the Omegan archive of Earth's history, and presumably of every other world they have observed across their billion-year history, is not a collection of files stored somewhere. It is a modification of the fabric of space-time in the vicinity of the observed system. The history of Earth is written into the quantum structure of the local space-time, and the Omegans are both the authors and the readers of that record. This framework, if it is correct, has implications that are genuinely staggering. It means that the information content of our world's entire history, every moment of it, at every level of physical resolution, is preserved in a form that is not merely stored, but is intrinsic to the physical reality of this region of space. It means that the past is not gone. It is present in the quantum structure of everything around us and accessible to any sufficiently advanced technology that knows how to read it. It means that the Omegan archive of the Earth is not something they carry with them or store elsewhere. It is here. It is us. It is the physical reality of this world, read by a sensory apparatus capable of reading it at the level at which it is written. The fourth element of the observational architecture is coordinative. The Omegans are not a single observer watching a single world. They are, to whatever extent the concepts of number and distribution apply to a civilization that may have moved significantly beyond the forms of existence we are familiar with, a distributed observational presence that encompasses, by most estimates in the research community, a very large number of inhabited or potentially inhabited worlds across this galaxy and possibly beyond it. The individual Omegan presence around Earth is not isolated. It is part of a network, part of a civilization-wide project of cosmic observation that encompasses, potentially, every world in the observable universe where life has arisen or might arise. And the coherence of that network, its ability to function as a unified observational project across the distances of interstellar and intergalactic space, requires a coordinative architecture that operates outside the constraints of the speed of light that limit our own communication and travel systems. The evidence for this coordinative architecture is, necessarily, indirect, but it is consistent. Multiple proximity event witnesses have described, in the rare moments when they have perceived something of the cognitive activity of the Omegan entities they encountered, a sense of connection to something enormously larger than the individual entity before them, not in the way that a human being is connected to a social network, not through communication channels that flow in specific directions at specific times, but in the way that every cell in a body is connected to the body, continuously, completely, without any gap or interval. A sense that the individual Omegan presence is not really individual at all, but is a local expression of something that is simultaneously present everywhere it has chosen to be present. Something distributed across space in a way that makes the concept of an individual entity somewhat misleading as a description. This quality of distributed presence is consistent with the theoretical framework discussed in the previous section that the Omegan body is not a localized physical structure, but a locally materialized expression of a much larger distributed cognitive system. If the Omegan consciousness is genuinely distributed, if individual Omegan presences are more like fingers of a hand than like separate individuals, then the coordinative architecture of their observational network is not a communication system in the sense we understand. It is simply the internal coherence of a mind that happens to be very large and very spread out. The coordination between Omegan presences around different worlds is the coordination of thoughts within a single mind, not messages sent across space, not information transmitted at the speed of light or faster, just the moment-to-moment coherence of a consciousness that has chosen to extend itself across the distances involved. The fifth and final element of the observational architecture is something that researchers have called, for lack of a better term, the perimeter calibration. It is the element that, in some ways, reveals the most about the Omegan approach to their task. The perimeter calibration is the systematic maintenance of the threshold of perceptibility that has already been mentioned, the precise positioning of the Omegan presence at exactly the edge of human awareness, not invisible but not confirmable, not absent but not present in any form that demands acknowledgement. This calibration is not accidental. It is not the byproduct of Omegan technology that happens to produce a visibility signature just at the threshold of human detection. The evidence indicates that it is deliberate, that the Omegans have specifically and intentionally calibrated their presence to be at exactly the level of perceptibility that produces the effects they want: awareness without certainty, curiosity without proof, a persistent sense of being watched without the confirmation that would make that sense undeniable. What effects do they want? Here we are back in the territory of Omegan philosophy rather than Omegan technology, and the most coherent explanation is the one already suggested. The Omegans appear to believe that the awareness of being observed, the persistent, uncertain, unprovable but unshakable sense of a watching presence, has a specific effect on the observed civilization. Not the effect of providing information, because they never communicate. Not the effect of warning or guiding, because they never intervene, but the subtler, more fundamental effect of what might be called existential calibration, the effect of being a civilization that knows, in some inarticulate but persistent way, that it is not alone, that something is watching, that the story it is living is being witnessed by something older and larger and wiser than itself. The effect perhaps of being a civilization that behaves as though it is being observed, because of course it is. Technology beyond comprehension. The technology of the Omegans is the aspect of their civilization that attracts the most immediate attention from the researchers, military personnel, and government officials who have had direct or indirect access to the physical evidence of their presence. This is understandable. Technology is the domain in which the gap between the Omegans and our own civilization is most immediately and dramatically visible. It is the domain in which the difference between a billion-year-old civilization and a few thousand-year-old one is most starkly apparent. And it is the domain in which the specific capabilities of the Omegans, the things they can do that we cannot, the physical effects they produce that our physics struggles to explain, provide the most concrete evidence for the claim that we are dealing with something genuinely and profoundly beyond our current understanding. But the technology of the Omegans is also the aspect of their civilization that is easiest to misunderstand, because the natural human tendency, when confronted with technology that exceeds our own, is to imagine it as an extension of what we already know, as better versions of our own tools, faster and more powerful, but fundamentally similar in kind. And this tendency leads us badly astray when applied to the Omegans, because their technology is not an extension of ours. It is not a better version of anything we are building or can imagine building in any extrapolation of our current trajectory. It is something that operates from a set of principles that our physics is only beginning to glimpse the existence of, at scales of complexity and integration that make any comparison with our own technology essentially meaningless. The starting point for understanding Omegan technology, the conceptual framework that makes it possible to even approach the subject coherently, is the relationship between information and physical reality. Our own technology, from the wheel to the integrated circuit, is based on the manipulation of matter and energy through processes that are governed by the laws of classical and quantum mechanics. We push things, pull things, heat things, cool things, charge things, discharge things. We use the properties of materials and the flows of energy to do work, to change the state of the physical world in ways that serve our purposes. This is, in essence, what technology means in the framework of human civilization, and it is extraordinarily powerful by any measure we have available, but it operates entirely within the framework of the laws of physics as we currently understand them. Omegan technology does not appear to operate within that framework, or more precisely, it appears to operate within a much larger framework, one that includes everything our physics describes, but extends well beyond it into domains we are only beginning to theorize about. The fundamental operating principle of Omegan technology appears to be not the manipulation of matter and energy per se, but the manipulation of the informational substrate that underlies physical reality. The idea, which has been gaining ground in theoretical physics for several decades now, is that information is more fundamental than matter or energy, that physical reality is, at its deepest level, a manifestation of informational structure, and that matter and energy are the forms that information takes when it is organized in certain ways under certain conditions. If this framework is correct, then the ultimate technology, the technology of a civilization at the far end of a billion-year development curve, would be not the manipulation of matter and energy, but the direct manipulation of information, of the underlying substrate from which matter and energy emerge. This is, admittedly, at the very edge of what our current theoretical framework can say anything meaningful about. But the evidence from Omegan technology, as it can be inferred from their observed capabilities, is remarkably consistent with this theoretical picture. Consider the most consistently reported and most physically anomalous capability of the Omegans, their apparent ability to dematerialize and rematerialize their physical presence, to simply cease to exist at one location without any physical process of departure and reappear at another without any physical process of arrival. This capability, which witnesses describe with sufficient consistency and specificity to be taken seriously as an observation, is impossible in terms of our conventional physics. It cannot be explained by any mechanism that operates within the framework of matter and energy as we understand them. But if the Omegan physical form is not a structure of matter in the conventional sense, but an organized pattern of information that happens to be expressed in material form, then dematerialization is simply the choice to stop expressing that information pattern in local material space, and rematerialization is the choice to begin expressing it again somewhere else. No object has moved. The information pattern, the Omegan equivalent of consciousness and form, has simply chosen a different locus of material expression. The same framework explains a second key Omegan capability, their apparent ability to interact with electromagnetic radiation in ways that violate conventional optics. The quality of visual indistinctness that witnesses consistently report, the sense that the Omegan form is harder to see when looked at directly than when observed peripherally, is not consistent with any conventional optical phenomenon. It is consistent, however, with an entity that is not fully committed to any specific material configuration, an entity whose physical form is maintained by a continuous informational process rather than by the fixed material structure that gives ordinary objects their stable optical properties. Such an entity would interact with light not in the fixed, deterministic way that ordinary matter does, but in a probabilistic, information-dependent way, its optical properties varying with its own internal states and choices in a way that no instrument calibrated to measure fixed material properties could reliably capture. The third Omegan capability that demands technological explanation is perhaps the most consequential from a military and intelligence perspective, which is why it has received the most serious attention from the official programs that have studied the physical evidence. This is the Omegans' apparent ability to make their craft and their physical presence completely undetectable, not just to visual observation, but to radar, infrared imaging, electromagnetic sensors, gravitational detection systems, and every other remote sensing technology that has been deployed in attempts to track them. This disappearance, documented in multiple classified observation reports across multiple decades, is not stealth in the conventional sense. Stealth technology, as developed in military aerospace engineering, reduces the radar cross-section of a vehicle by shaping its exterior and applying radar-absorbing materials. It is a passive, structural approach to reducing detectability. The Omegan disappearance is active, it is total, and it happens instantaneously, not gradually, as would be expected from any passive shielding system, but in zero time, producing no residual signal, no thermal bloom, no gravitational ripple, nothing, as though the thing that was there a moment before had never existed. A plausible explanation for this capability within the informational framework being developed here is that the Omegans are able to disengage their physical presence from the informational layer that makes it detectable. Our detection systems, all of them, from the eye to the most sophisticated radar array, work by detecting the ways in which a physical object interacts with the surrounding environment. Light bounces off it. Electromagnetic waves are reflected or absorbed by it. Its mass curves local space-time in a way that can, in principle, be measured. All of these detectable signatures arise from the fact that the object is committed to a specific material configuration that necessarily interacts with its physical surroundings. If the Omegans can disengage from that commitment, can withdraw their physical form from material interaction without fully dematerializing, they would be effectively undetectable by any instrument that measures the interactions of ordinary matter with its environment. They would be there in some deeper informational sense, but would not be participating in the physical interactions that all our detection systems depend on. They would be, in the most literal possible sense, beyond our ability to see. The craft associated with the Omegan presence display capabilities that are consistent with this framework, and equally anomalous in conventional physical terms. They are detected performing maneuvers that are impossible for any vehicle governed by classical mechanics. Instantaneous changes of direction at extreme velocities, without any deceleration or turning radius. Acceleration from zero to extraordinary speeds in zero time, without any propulsion signature, hovering at fixed points in space relative to the Earth's surface, in defiance of orbital mechanics, without any active thrust. These capabilities, which are documented not just in anecdotal witness testimony, but in the recorded data of military radar systems and tracking instruments, have been the subject of serious analysis by aerospace and physics experts within the classified research programs. The conclusion of that analysis, in the accounts that have emerged from those programs, is consistent. These capabilities cannot be explained by any extension of known physics. They require a physical framework that has not yet been formally developed, a framework in which the relationship between mass, energy, space, and time operates on principles that are not captured in Einstein's general relativity or in the standard model of particle physics. The framework that best accounts for all of these capabilities, and that is increasingly discussed in the more advanced levels of the research community, involves the direct manipulation of space-time geometry, the ability to modify the curvature of space and the rate of time in the immediate vicinity of the craft or the entity, such that the conventional physical constraints of inertia, momentum, and gravitation simply do not apply in the normal way. This is not science fiction. The physics of space-time curvature is established science. Einstein's general relativity describes it precisely and accurately. What is beyond our current capability is the generation of sufficient energy density to produce macroscopically significant space-time curvature using any technology we possess. The Omegans, with 1 billion years of technological development behind them, have apparently solved this problem. The result is a technology that operates not by pushing through space in the way that all our vehicles do, but by reshaping space around itself. A vehicle that does not move through space so much as it moves space around itself. A physical presence that does not interact with the environment in the normal way because it is continuously modifying the environment, the local space-time fabric, to suit its requirements. The implications of this framework extend well beyond transportation and detection. If the Omegans can modify space-time geometry at will, then their observational capabilities are also operating at this level. They can, in principle, observe not just the present state of the physical systems they are watching, but their past states, reading the information content encoded in the space-time structure of the local region, the quantum record of everything that has happened in this vicinity, going back as far as the physical laws allow information to be preserved. They can, in principle, observe at any scale and from any perspective, not constrained to a single spatial vantage point, the way that our cameras and telescopes are, but able to reconstruct a complete three-dimensional, temporally extended picture of whatever they are observing from the information available in the local space-time structure. And they can observe without interacting, without disturbing the system they are observing, by reading the information content of the space-time fabric directly rather than bouncing photons off the surface of things and measuring the result. This last capability is perhaps the most philosophically significant of all. It means that the Omegan observation of Earth is not just comprehensive in its spatial and temporal coverage, it is, in principle, non-disturbing. The perfect observation, the one that does not change what it observes by the act of observing, is the stated ideal of multiple traditions of scientific methodology. It is the limit that quantum mechanics tells us can never be fully achieved by any observer constrained to physical interaction with the system being observed. The Omegans appear to have achieved it. They observe from outside the system, from the informational substrate that underlies the physical reality of the observed system, in a way that does not require physical interaction, and therefore does not disturb what is being observed. The perfect witness, the observer that does not change what it sees, the watching that leaves no trace because it does not touch. This is Omegan technology applied to its deepest purpose, not transport, not defense, not the manipulation of matter for material ends, but the perfect, complete, non-disturbing observation of everything that exists. The language that is not spoken. Language is the most fundamental technology that intelligence has ever developed. More fundamental than fire, more fundamental than the wheel, more fundamental than writing or mathematics or the computer, because all of those things depend on language. Language is the medium in which thought achieves its full complexity, in which knowledge is transmitted across individuals and generations, in which the shared understanding that makes civilization possible is built and maintained and revised. Without language, intelligence remains locked within the boundaries of the individual mind. With it, intelligence becomes something collective, cumulative, historical. Something that grows across time in ways that no individual mind, however capable, could generate on its own. The question of how the Omegans communicate, or whether they communicate in any sense that the word communication adequately captures, is therefore not a peripheral question about an interesting cognitive feature of an alien species. It is a central question about the nature of their intelligence, their civilization, and their relationship to the universe they observe. And the answer to that question, insofar as it can be inferred from the available evidence, is one of the most challenging aspects of the Omegan phenomenon to come to terms with. Because the answer appears to be that the Omegans do not use language, not a form of language that is different from ours in its medium, but similar in its function. Not a more advanced or more efficient version of what we do when we speak or write or sign. Something that is, at its core, so different from the concept of language as we understand it, that the word communication may not even be the right term to apply to it. Start with what we know. The Omegans, in every documented proximity event, in every historical account, in every physical observation of their craft and their presence, are silent. Not just vocally silent, they produce no sounds that have been detected by any acoustic monitoring system in any of the contexts where they have been observed. They are electromagnetically silent. Their craft produce no radio frequency emissions, no microwave signals, no patterns of electromagnetic radiation that would correspond to any known form of communication technology. They are behaviorally silent. They make no gestures, display no postures, produce no visual signals that observers have been able to interpret as communicative acts directed toward the human beings in proximity to them. In every channel through which we look for communication, we find silence. Absolute, complete, undifferentiated silence. And yet, the proximity event witnesses consistently describe something that is the opposite of a lack of communication. They describe an experience that is, in many accounts, the most intense experience of being communicated with that they have ever had. Not communicated to, not the reception of messages from an external source, but communicated with, in the sense of being in a state of connection, of mutual awareness, of shared presence, so complete and so immediate that the word communication feels inadequate to describe it. Multiple witnesses have used the same language, independently and across widely separated cultural and temporal contexts. The experience of being in Omegan proximity is described as being known rather than being spoken to, as being understood rather than being given information, as a form of contact that bypasses language entirely and operates at a level that language both cannot reach and is not needed to reach. What this suggests, taken together with the theoretical framework being developed throughout this account, is that the Omegans have moved beyond language in the way that a civilization with sufficient technological and cognitive development would be expected to move beyond language. Language, for us, serves as a proxy for direct mind-to-mind awareness. We use words to represent thoughts and feelings and intentions and perceptions because we have no way to transmit those things directly, no way to share the actual content of one mind with another except through the indirect medium of encoded symbols. Language is, at bottom, a compression algorithm for experience, deployed to overcome the fundamental isolation of individual minds from each other. A very good algorithm, capable of tremendous things, but an algorithm nonetheless, with all the lossy compression and the ambiguity and the gap between the symbol and the thing it symbolizes that any compression algorithm necessarily has. The Omegans appear to have developed, or perhaps evolved, the ability to bypass the algorithm, to transmit not the symbols but the things themselves, not the words that describe a mental state, but the mental state directly. Not the language that encodes a perception, but the perception itself. This is not telepathy in the science fiction sense of reading individual surface thoughts. It is something more fundamental and more complete. The direct sharing of cognitive states between minds without any intervening medium. An experience of mutual awareness so complete and so unmediated that the distinction between I know something and I am communicating that knowledge to you loses its meaning, because the knowing and the sharing are the same act. This form of what might be called direct cognitive resonance, the Omegan equivalent of communication, would explain several features of the proximity event experience that otherwise remain mysterious. The first is the quality of being known that witnesses consistently describe. If the Omegan mode of interaction involves direct cognitive resonance rather than symbolic exchange, then an Omegan observing a human being is not merely looking at them. It is coming into a form of direct cognitive contact with them, sharing, for a moment, the same awareness, not merging minds in any science fiction sense, but briefly overlapping the field of awareness, so that both the observer and the observed are present simultaneously in the same cognitive moment. For the human being, this experience is overwhelming precisely because the Omegan mind that briefly overlaps with theirs is incomparably larger, older, and more comprehensive. The experience is not of being communicated to by something vast. It is of being briefly included in the awareness of something vast, of having one's own small, local, temporally bounded consciousness briefly touched by a consciousness that is none of those things. The second feature of the proximity event that direct cognitive resonance would explain is the characteristic sense of temporal displacement, the way that multiple witnesses describe the experience as somehow outside of normal time, as compressing or stretching the experience of duration in a way that does not correspond to the actual elapsed time of the encounter. This feature, which is among the most consistently reported and most difficult to explain in conventional psychological terms, makes sense if the Omegan mode of awareness does not operate within the same temporal framework as human consciousness. We are creatures of sequential time. Our consciousness unfolds in a series of moments, each one giving way to the next, with no ability to directly perceive anything except the present moment. The Omegans, with their billion-year perspective and their apparent ability to read the information content of space-time directly, may not be constrained to sequential time in the way we are. They may perceive temporal events not sequentially but simultaneously, experiencing the full temporal extent of a system not as a series of moments, but as a single, complete, four-dimensional whole. A brief overlap of human sequential consciousness with Omegan non-sequential awareness would produce exactly the kind of temporal distortion that witnesses describe. A moment that feels simultaneously very short and very long. A flash of contact that somehow contains, within its duration, more information and more presence than any equivalent duration of ordinary experience. The third feature that direct cognitive resonance would explain is the emotional character of the proximity event experience. The consistent description, across witnesses with very different cultural frameworks and emotional temperaments, of a quality of peace or expansion or stillness. This emotional quality is not what would be expected if the proximity event were simply an encounter with an unknown or threatening entity. It is what would be expected if the encounter involved a brief overlap of human consciousness with a consciousness that is genuinely at peace in the deepest sense, not the superficial sense of an absence of immediate distress, but at peace in the way that a mind is at peace when it has genuinely come to terms with everything it knows and everything it has seen. A mind that has been observing the universe for 1 billion years, that has witnessed the full spectrum of what intelligence and life and matter and energy are capable of, and that has found in that witnessing a relationship to existence that does not produce distress. The quality of that peace, briefly touching the human consciousness that comes into proximity with it, produces the sensation that witnesses describe, not the peace of being reassured, but the peace of being briefly included in a form of awareness that is itself peaceful, at home in the universe, comfortable in the full knowledge of what it contains. The absence of language in Omegan communication also tells us something important about the nature of their civilization and their relationship to each other, to whatever constitutes their equivalent of a social community. Language, in human civilization, is not just a communication medium, it is a social technology, a way of negotiating shared meaning, of building the common understanding that makes collective action possible, of mediating the differences in perspective and information and value that necessarily exist between separate individuals. If the Omegans do not use language, it is partly because they do not need a medium to transmit their cognitive states. They can share those states directly. But it is also, perhaps, because the conditions that make language necessary in human social life, the radical separateness of individual minds, the incompleteness of any one perspective, the fundamental opacity of other people's inner lives, do not apply to the Omegans in the same way. If Omegan consciousness is genuinely distributed, if individual Omegan presences are expressions of a larger cognitive system rather than truly separate minds, then the fundamental social problem that language evolved to solve does not exist for them. They are not separate from each other in the way we are separate from each other. The coordination problem that language addresses, how do separate individuals align their understanding and their action, is not a problem for a civilization that is not fundamentally individual. This has profound implications for how we should think about the Omegan observational project. The comprehensive observation of an inhabited world, conducted by a distributed consciousness across geological timescales, is not the work of individual observers reporting back to a central authority or of teams communicating through language channels to coordinate their work. It is more like the work of a single organism directing the activities of its own sensory organs. The Omegan presences around Earth are not individual scientists. They are more like the eyes and ears and nervous system of a single vast awareness, locally present, locally processing, but continuously integrated into a larger cognitive whole that is simultaneously present everywhere it has chosen to be. The observation of Earth is one thread in a tapestry of observation that encompasses, potentially, every inhabited world in the observable universe. And the cognitive integration of all those threads, the simultaneous awareness of everything being observed everywhere at once, is what the Omegan civilization, taken as a whole, is. Not a collection of individuals. Not a society in any sense we have a model for, a single, vast, distributed awareness turned toward the universe in an act of witnessing so comprehensive that the universe, through the Omegans, is effectively observing itself. Omegan society, hierarchy and stillness. The concept of society implies a plurality of individuals, separate beings who have developed systems of relationship, coordination, and shared purpose that allow them to function collectively in ways that individual action alone cannot achieve. It implies communication between those individuals, the negotiation of shared norms, the distribution of roles and resources, the management of conflict and cooperation. All of this, in turn, implies difference. Differences in perspective, in capability, in role, in relationship to the collective. Without difference, there is no need for the systems that society develops to manage it. Without plurality, there is no society at all. The Omegans present, as we have seen, a challenge to the concept of individuality as we understand it. If their consciousness is genuinely distributed, if individual presences are expressions of a larger cognitive whole rather than genuinely separate minds, then the concept of society, as we typically understand it, may not apply to them in any straightforward way. But the evidence suggests that the situation is not quite as simple as a single undifferentiated awareness distributed uniformly across space. There is structure within the Omegan collective. There is hierarchy, not in the political sense of power over others, but in the sense of differentiated function. Different levels or aspects of the Omegan collective consciousness that serve different roles in the overall project of observation. And understanding that structure, however approximately, helps us understand how a civilization, the size and age of the Omegans, can maintain the coherence and continuity of purpose that its behavior reveals. The evidence for internal differentiation within the Omegan collective comes from several sources. The most direct is the observation that Omegan presences around Earth are not all of the same type or the same apparent level of engagement. Proximity event accounts describe encounters with entities that vary in the quality and intensity of their presence, some described as more fully materialized, more visually distinct, more locally present in their engagement with the immediate environment. Others are described as barely present, as more of a quality of awareness in the local space than an entity with a defined form, and still others are described as present only as a quality of attention, a directedness, a sense of being the object of a focused awareness without any accompanying physical manifestation at all. These variations suggest a hierarchy of engagement, a range of modes in which the Omegan collective chooses to manifest its presence in a given location, from the most minimal, which amounts to the bare fact of attention being directed to that location, to the most fully realized, which involves the local materialization of a physical form capable of producing the kind of deep proximity event experience that witnesses describe. The choice of engagement mode appears to be calibrated to the specific observational requirements of the situation. More fully materialized presences in situations that require closer observation of specific phenomena. More minimal presences in situations where distant monitoring serves the purpose. Within the Omegan collective, researchers have theorized the existence of what might be called functional specializations, aspects or components of the larger awareness that have developed particular depth of attention toward particular domains of the observed universe. This would be the Omegan equivalent of academic or professional specialization, not separate individuals with separate training and separate careers, but differentiated aspects of a distributed consciousness that has developed over billions of years an extraordinary depth of focused attention in certain domains. One such specialization, clearly implied by the evidence from Earth, is what might be called planetary consciousness study, the close, sustained observation of individual inhabited worlds, with particular attention to the emergence and development of intelligence. This specialization appears to be what the Omegan presence around Earth primarily represents, a component of the larger Omegan awareness that has developed extraordinary depth of attention toward the specific challenge and the specific story of this particular world. The relationship between these functional specializations and the larger Omegan collective is not one of separateness and communication. The specialized components do not report back to a central authority. It is more like the relationship between a specific region of a complex brain and the brain as a whole. The visual cortex is specialized for visual processing, but it is not separate from the brain. Its activity is continuously integrated into the brain's overall function. Similarly, the Omegan functional specialization for planetary observation is continuously integrated into the larger Omegan awareness. Its findings do not need to be transmitted because the awareness that produces them is continuous with the awareness that uses them. This means that the Omegan decision to observe Earth and the decision about how to observe it, at what intensity, with what level of local materialization, is not the decision of an individual or a committee. It is the decision of the larger Omegan awareness operating through its relevant functional specializations in response to the totality of what it knows and perceives. A decision that emerges from the full complexity of a billion years of cosmic observation applied to the specific situation of a young inhabited world at a particular phase of its development. A decision that is, from the Omegan perspective, not so much made as recognized as the right response to the situation, in the way that a mature organism recognizes the right response to a stimulus, not by deliberating about it, but by being the kind of organism that has developed, through long experience, the wisdom to respond appropriately without deliberation. What we would call governance, the systems by which a civilization makes and enforces collective decisions, appears to be similarly transformed by the nature of Omegan consciousness. The conventional functions of governance in any complex civilization are coordination, ensuring that the parts of the collective act consistently toward shared goals; constraint, preventing the parts from acting in ways that harm the collective or conflict with its values; and adaptation, allowing the collective to revise its goals and methods in response to new information. All three of these functions in human civilizations require active systems of communication, enforcement, and decision-making because the individuals and subgroups that make up the civilization are genuinely separate and potentially in conflict. In the Omegan collective, none of these functions requires a system of external governance because the conditions that would make such a system necessary, the separateness of individuals, the possibility of conflicting interests, the need to communicate to achieve alignment, do not apply. The coordination is intrinsic to the distributed nature of the consciousness. The constraints emerge from the deep values and understanding that a billion years of experience has produced. The adaptation is continuous because the collective awareness is continuously integrating new information from all its observational foci simultaneously. What remains within this picture of a highly integrated collective consciousness is the question of whether anything like individuality exists at all within the Omegan collective. Whether there is anything that, from the inside, resembles the experience of being a separate self, of being this particular awareness rather than all possible awarenesses. The answer, based on the proximity event evidence and on the theoretical considerations discussed earlier, seems to be something intermediate. The Omegan collective is neither a single undifferentiated awareness nor a collection of truly separate individuals. It is something in between, something for which our language does not have a good term because we have no experience of anything analogous. A consciousness that is both genuinely plural and genuinely unified, that contains within it genuine points of local concentration, specific loci of focused awareness that serve specific observational functions, while remaining continuously integrated into a larger whole that is present everywhere those loci are present. The closest human analogy might be the relationship between the individual moments of consciousness that make up a human lifetime. Each moment of awareness has a specific quality, a specific content, a specific locus in time, but all the moments together constitute a single mind, a continuous awareness that is not merely the sum of its moments, but something that transcends and contains them. The relationship between an individual Omegan local presence and the larger Omegan collective might be analogous to the relationship between a single moment of human consciousness and the full, lifelong consciousness of the human being. The moment is real. The presence is genuine. but it is a local expression of something much larger, and its individuality is functional rather than fundamental, a matter of local concentration within a distributed whole, not a matter of genuine separateness from it. This picture of Omegan society, more accurately described as a distributed, hierarchically structured collective awareness, has direct implications for the way we should think about the Omegan observational project. The project is not carried out by individuals who chose it as a career, who might retire or change their minds or develop conflicting interests. It is carried out by a consciousness that is the project, that has organized itself around the act of witnessing as its fundamental identity and purpose. To ask why the Omegans continue to observe is to ask why a consciousness that has made witnessing its defining activity continues to witness. The answer is the same as the answer to why water is wet or why fire is hot. Because that is what it is. Because witnessing, at the scale and depth the Omegans practice it, is not something they do. It is something they are. The paradox of non-intervention. There is no aspect of the Omegan presence that generates more intense moral and philosophical debate within the research community. And when the research community's findings have filtered into broader public awareness in the broader culture, than the question of non-intervention. The fact that an intelligence of the age, capability, and apparent comprehension of the Omegans has watched in complete detail the full history of human civilization, every war, every genocide, every epidemic, every century of systematic cruelty, every moment of mass suffering on a scale that defies the imagination, and has not intervened, has not spoken, has not reached down with its incomprehensible technology to stop any of it, has not offered any guidance, any warning, any resource, any tool that might have made any part of the suffering less severe, has simply watched and continued to watch in complete silence while the story has unfolded in all its terrible and magnificent complexity. The moral weight of this is genuinely difficult to hold. It is not abstract. We are talking about real suffering on a historical scale that staggers even the partial understanding of it that historical scholarship has managed to achieve. We are talking about the death by violence and starvation and disease and preventable catastrophe of billions of human beings across the span of human history. Billions of lives, each one of them as immediate and as real and as significant in its individual particularity as any life being lived today. We are talking about civilizations of extraordinary sophistication and creativity being literally burned to the ground by invaders who met no resistance from any intelligence vastly more powerful than either side. We are talking about the tens of millions who died in the wars of the 20th century alone, the millions who perished in famines that better organized food distribution could have prevented, the countless individuals and communities and cultures that simply ended, leaving nothing, taking with them possibilities and meanings and beauties that the world has never recovered. All of this happened while the Omegans watched. All of this was seen, recorded, held in that vast and comprehensive awareness that observes at the level of individual human experience as well as the level of civilizational trajectory. The Omegans knew about all of it, and they did nothing. They said nothing. They gave no sign that they were present, or that they cared, or that any of it mattered to them beyond its value as data in a long observational record. This is the paradox, and it is a genuine paradox, not one that dissolves on careful examination, but one that becomes sharper the more carefully you examine it. On one hand, the Omegan philosophy of non-intervention, as discussed earlier, is coherent and defensible. The argument that intervention would contaminate the very developmental process they are observing, that the butterfly must emerge from the chrysalis on its own terms, or the wings will not work, is not a trivial argument. It has real philosophical force. It is consistent with principles that human developmental science and ecology, and indeed ethics, have independently reached, through different paths and on smaller scales. The argument that a civilization a billion years old has the perspective to understand what suffering is and is not in service of, to see the developmental necessity of difficulty in a way that those inside the difficulty cannot see, is also not trivially dismissed. It requires a response rather than mere rejection. But the other horn of the paradox is equally sharp, Because there is a point at which the commitment to non-intervention ceases to be a principle and becomes something harder to defend, there is a point at which the willingness to watch suffering of sufficient magnitude without acting to prevent it is not a philosophical position, but a moral failure, however coherent the philosophical arguments offered in its defense. And the question of whether the Omegan presence around Earth represents the admirable, incomprehensible patience of a civilization that understands the long game, or the moral failure of an intelligence so old and so different that it has lost the capacity to respond to the immediate reality of suffering with anything more than record-keeping. This question does not have a clean answer. It is the question that sits at the heart of the paradox, and it does not resolve. What the research community has developed in wrestling with this paradox over decades is not a resolution, but a set of frameworks for thinking about it more carefully. The first framework is the developmental argument already discussed. That intervention at the wrong stage of a civilization's development prevents the development of the capacities that the civilization needs to reach its next level. The second framework is what researchers have called the contamination argument. That the introduction of Omegan technology or Omegan knowledge into human civilization at any point in our history would not have alleviated suffering, but would have radically altered the trajectory of our development in ways that the Omegans cannot predict and would not be responsible for. That the gift of advanced technology to a civilization not yet mature enough to use it wisely is not a gift at all, but a catastrophe waiting to happen. A lesson that human history itself supports, given what we have done with our own technological developments at every stage of our history. The third framework is the agency argument, that the deepest respect one intelligence can pay to another is to treat it as capable of determining its own course. That intervention, however well-intentioned, is a denial of agency, a statement, however implicit, that the intervening civilization knows better than the one it is intervening in, and that the Omegan commitment to non-intervention is, in part, a commitment to treating human civilization as fully responsible for itself in the same way that we recognize, however imperfectly, the moral principle that human beings deserve the dignity of self-determination. These frameworks are all, in their different ways, coherent. They are all illuminated by genuine insights, and they all, ultimately, fall short of fully resolving the paradox, because none of them can quite account for the specific, concrete, overwhelming reality of the suffering they are being used to justify not acting to prevent. The developmental argument is compelling in the abstract and becomes strained when you try to apply it to a specific person in a specific moment of specific agony. The contamination argument acknowledges the risks of intervention without addressing the risks of non-intervention, the catastrophes that a small piece of specific information or a single targeted act of prevention might have averted without radically altering the developmental trajectory of the civilization. The agency argument, at its limit, can be used to justify inaction in the face of any harm inflicted by one human being on another, which is not a principle that any moral tradition has ever found fully satisfying. The most honest position in the research community is that the moral status of Omegan non-intervention is genuinely uncertain, that it may be, simultaneously, both the most respectful and the most painful possible form of regard for a young civilization by an old one. That the Omegan silence is both a gift and a wound. Both the expression of a form of care so large it cannot be experienced from inside the human condition as care, and a genuine moral failing measured against the standards of the immediate and the particular, both philosophically coherent and humanly intolerable. Both the right thing to do from a perspective we cannot fully occupy and the wrong thing to do from a perspective we cannot escape. What is perhaps most important to acknowledge in approaching this paradox is that it is not unique to the Omegan situation. It is a version of a paradox that human beings confront in multiple domains of our own moral and political life. The paradox between the principle of non-interference and the obligation to prevent harm, between the respect for autonomy and the duty of care, between the long view and the immediate view, between the developmental benefit of challenge and the moral horror of preventable suffering. We have not resolved this paradox in our own context. We hold it imperfectly in an ongoing tension between competing values that we have never fully integrated. The Omegans appear to have resolved it, to have come down definitively on the side of non-intervention, and to have maintained that resolution with a consistency that we have never achieved in any equivalent domain. Whether that resolution represents a moral achievement, a genuine philosophical wisdom that we should aspire to, or a moral failure, an abandonment of the immediate for the abstract that we should resist, is perhaps the most important question that the Omegan presence forces us to confront about ourselves and our own values. Because ultimately, the question of the Omegans and non-intervention is a question about us, about what kind of intelligence we want to be, about what the relationship between power and responsibility should look like at civilizational scales, about how we would behave, how we would want to behave, if we ever reach the point of being the ones with the technology, the perspective, and the longevity to watch younger civilizations struggle with the challenges of their development. The Omegans, in their silence, are not just a presence around our world. They are a mirror, the oldest, most comprehensive, most demanding mirror that has ever been held up to humanity. And what we see in that mirror, what the reflection of the Omegan presence reveals about our own deepest values and our own deepest fears, is the real subject of the observation. Humanity's hunt for contact. The history of human attempts to make contact with the Omegans is, in many ways, the history of a frustration. A sustained, sincere, increasingly sophisticated frustration that has been building for the last 75 years of organized, institutionally supported effort, and that has been building in less organized forms for the entire span of human civilization. The frustration of reaching toward something that does not reach back, of calling to a presence that does not answer, of developing, decade by decade, new technologies and new methods and new frameworks for understanding and finding, at the end of each advance, that the thing you are trying to reach has simply maintained its position at the edge of your new reach, as it has maintained its position at the edge of every previous level of your reach. Always there, always just beyond, always watching the attempt to reach it with the same comprehensive, imperturbable, utterly silent attention that it has given to everything else you have ever done. The official attempts to make contact with, or even simply to study, the Omegans began in the immediate post-war period, in the context of the broader classification and study of aerial phenomena that the new radar networks had revealed. The early programs were not specifically designed around the Omegan phenomenon. They were designed to investigate the full range of reported anomalous aerial phenomena, and the Omegans were recognized as a distinct category within that broader field only gradually, as the data from multiple investigations began to converge on the specific behavioral and technological signature that distinguished Omegan craft from other reported phenomena. The key distinguishing feature, the absolute refusal to engage when approached, and the complete and instantaneous disappearance when engagement was imminent, emerged from the data across multiple independent investigations spanning the late 1940s and early 1950s. By the mid-1950s, a small group of analysts within the classified programs had begun to treat the Omegans as a distinct phenomenon requiring a distinct analytical approach. The first systematic attempt to make contact with the Omegans was not, as might be imagined, a sophisticated technological effort. It was a remarkably simple one, and in its simplicity, it was perhaps the most honest statement of the fundamental asymmetry involved. The idea was this: if the Omegans could detect our radar systems, could detect our aircraft, could position themselves around our planet with evident precision and evident awareness of our activities, then they were clearly monitoring our electromagnetic emissions. They knew we were there. They knew we could detect them, at least intermittently. If they wanted to respond to us, all they needed to do was reply to one of our signals. They could modulate the reflection of our own radar beams. They could emit a radio signal at a frequency we were monitoring. They could do anything, really. The sophistication of their technology meant that responding in any form we could detect was trivially easy for them if they wanted to do it. The simple act of deciding to respond was all that stood between the silence and an answer. The silence continued. Multiple attempts over the following decades refined the approach without changing the fundamental dynamic. Radio astronomers, beginning in the late 1950s with the pioneering work of projects like SETI and its successors, developed increasingly sensitive instruments for detecting artificial signals in the electromagnetic spectrum. The search, originally conceived as looking for signals from distant civilizations across interstellar space, was quietly broadened in classified research contexts to include the monitoring of frequencies and signal types that might correspond to Omegan communication, on the theory that a civilization present in this solar system, however minimally and however non-communicatively, might be detectable through its incidental electromagnetic emissions, even if it was not deliberately broadcasting. Decades of monitoring produced nothing. The Omegans are electromagnetically silent, not merely not broadcasting, but apparently emitting nothing across any frequency range that our instruments can detect. The absence of emissions is itself a form of technology, consistent with the picture developed in the discussion of Omegan physics, a presence that does not interact with its environment through ordinary electromagnetic processes. The military attempts to make contact with the Omegans were more direct, and the results were both more informative and more humbling. Beginning in the late 1940s and continuing through several decades, military pilots and crews who detected Omegan craft in their operational areas were instructed, at various points in the history of the classified programs, to approach and attempt to engage the detected phenomena, not hostilely, but in the way that a military aircraft approaches an unknown contact, which is to say directly and with intent to close the range and establish the nature of what is being detected. The results of these attempts were, without exception, the same. The phenomena disappeared instantaneously and completely before the approaching aircraft could close to within a visually meaningful range. No craft was ever successfully approached, no engagement, no communication, no visual contact at close range, no physical interaction of any kind was ever achieved. The Omegans maintained their distance with perfect precision, never allowing an approach beyond a specific threshold, never responding to the approach with anything other than disappearance, and, apparently, never departing permanently in response to the attempt. Because every time the military presence withdrew, the phenomena returned to their previous positions, as though the disappearance was not an escape, but a step backward, a maintenance of the perimeter, a brief pause while the intrusion passed. The civilian research community, working largely without access to the classified military data, but drawing on the accumulated testimony of civilian witnesses and the publicly available portions of official investigation reports, developed a very different approach to the contact question. The dominant strand of thinking in the civilian research community, from the 1970s onward, was that the key to making contact with the Omegans, if contact were possible at all, was not technological, but qualitative. Not a matter of having better radar or more sensitive detectors or faster aircraft, but a matter of approaching the interaction in the right spirit, of presenting not a military posture, but an observational one, becoming, in some sense, like the Omegans themselves, patient, still, non-invasive, genuinely oriented toward understanding rather than control. This approach, while it sounds more like philosophy than science, was not without its logic. It was consistent with the behavioral evidence. The Omegans maintained their distance from military and technological approaches specifically. They had never, in any documented account, initiated contact or reduced their distance in response to a technological engagement. But the proximity event testimonies suggested that something different had occasionally happened, that individuals, typically in states of heightened perceptual openness and typically in natural settings removed from technological infrastructure, had experienced close Omegan presence not as a confrontation, but as something more like a mutual moment. Not contact, not communication, not response in any conventional sense, but a quality of mutual awareness, a brief moment in which the normal perimeter was not enforced, in which the Omegan presence was felt not at the edge of perception, but within it. Attempts to reliably reproduce these conditions, to create the circumstances that seemed to allow the perimeter to thin, have been only partially successful. Groups of researchers who have attempted sustained, silent, technology-free observation in locations associated with Omegan activity have occasionally reported experiences consistent with proximity events, the quality of comprehensive attention, the sensation of being perceived in depth, the characteristic temporal distortion, These reports are difficult to evaluate rigorously because the conditions that seem to favor them are precisely the conditions that are hardest to instrument. The presence of technology appears to either drive the Omegans to greater distance or to prevent the quality of attention required for the proximity event experience to register. You cannot easily place cameras and recording devices in the middle of an attempt to achieve a state of perceptual openness to a non-technological presence without affecting both the state and the presence. The most honest assessment of the contact effort after 75 years of organized attempt is this: we have not made contact with the Omegans. We have not succeeded in any of the conventional sense of that phrase. We have not established communication, received a response, or achieved any form of recognized, deliberate interaction from their side. What we have achieved is a better understanding of the parameters of their non-contact, a clearer picture of what they will and will not respond to, what approaches they maintain their distance from, and what conditions seem to allow a closer quality of presence. We have confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt that they are aware of our attempts to contact them. The precision with which they have maintained their perimeter across decades of increasingly sophisticated contact attempts could not have been achieved by entities that were unaware of those attempts. They know we are trying to reach them. They know they are there, and they have chosen, consistently and deliberately, not to respond. What does this choice mean? The research community has wrestled with this question as seriously as any other, and the most nuanced position it has arrived at is this: the Omegan refusal to engage with our contact attempts is not necessarily a statement about the impossibility or the undesirability of contact in principle. It is a statement about the timing, about where we are in the developmental arc that they have been observing. The Omegans have observed enough civilizations, the argument goes, and have developed a deep enough understanding of what contact at the wrong stage of development does to a young civilization, to know that initiating contact with us now, on our terms, in response to our overtures, would not serve the purposes that their observation serves. The contact will happen, or it will not happen, on their terms, at the moment they judge appropriate, if such a moment arrives. And the question of whether we will ever reach the point in our development at which they judge us ready for that contact is one that no one, not the Omegans, and certainly not us, can answer in advance. This is not a satisfying conclusion, but it may be the honest one. The Omegans have been watching us for the entirety of our existence as a species. They have watched us develop the tools and the questions that have led us to this moment. The moment at which we are aware of them, aware of our awareness of them, and engaged in the serious, systematic, increasingly sophisticated effort to understand what they are and what their presence means. They have watched the frustration of that effort, and they have maintained their silence through all of it. And in that silence, as in everything else about them, there is a message, not a message encoded in any medium we can read, but a message nonetheless. The message of the silence itself, that we are not yet at the place where the silence will end, that the watching continues, that the story is not finished, and that when it is, when whatever chapter of the human story the Omegans have been waiting for finally begins to unfold, the quality of attention being directed at this world will be exactly what it has always been: complete, unwavering, ancient beyond our capacity to fully comprehend, and still silent. The watchers in myth, religion, and cultural memory. No examination of the Omegan presence in human history would be complete without a sustained engagement with the domain in which that presence has left its most pervasive and most culturally consequential mark: the domain of myth, religion, and what psychologists and anthropologists call cultural memory. The deep, transgenerational transmission of collective experience that shapes the worldview of a civilization in ways that persist long after the specific events that generated them have been forgotten. This is the domain in which the Omegans have been most continuously and most influentially present, not in the sense of appearing in specific, documented, historically verifiable incidents, but in the sense of leaving an impression in the fabric of human consciousness that has expressed itself in every era and in every cultural context as a fundamental feature of the human experience of being alive in a universe that contains something older and stranger than itself. The presence of a watching presence, something that observes without intervening, that knows without speaking, that is there at the edge of awareness without ever fully resolving into certainty, is not a marginal feature of human mythological and religious traditions. It is, when you examine the full breadth of the tradition rather than its familiar surface, one of its most central features. It appears in so many forms, under so many names, in so many cultural contexts, that the challenge is not to find it, but to keep from being overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of its manifestations. The concept of the all-seeing eye is perhaps the most universal of these manifestations. It appears in Egyptian religion in the form of the Eye of Ra and the Eye of Horus, the divine gaze that encompasses all of creation, that sees into every corner of existence, that knows what is hidden as well as what is visible. It appears in Hinduism in multiple forms, most notably in the concept of the witness consciousness, the pure awareness that underlies all experience and observes it without being conditioned by it. It appears in Christianity in the concept of the divine omniscience, the absolute knowledge of everything by a being outside of time who sees the totality of creation as a single, complete moment. It appears in Islam in the concept of God as al-Basir, the all-seeing, whose awareness encompasses every moment of every creature's existence without gap or limitation. It appears in Buddhism in the concept of the Buddha's omniscience, the ability to perceive the full reality of all phenomena across all times simultaneously. It appears in indigenous traditions across the world in the forms of sky spirits, ancestor watchers, and the eyes of the natural world that see everything and are not bound by human frameworks of judgment. All of these are, of course, theological constructs, the expressions of human religious imagination about the nature of the ultimate reality. They are not, in their mainstream theological interpretation, descriptions of an alien civilization, but the consistency with which the concept of the all-seeing, non-intervening, silence-maintaining watcher appears across traditions that have no historical connection to each other is not easily explained by the independent operation of human religious imagination. The human mind tends to produce gods that intervene, gods who respond to prayer, who take sides in conflicts, who provide and withhold in response to human behavior. The watcher who does not intervene, who does not respond, who simply sees and maintains its complete and comprehensive silence. This figure is not the natural product of the religious imagination's desire for a divine that is relevant to human experience. It is rather something that the religious imagination has encountered and tried to make sense of within its theological framework, something that came from outside the framework and has left its mark on every framework it touched. The philosophical tradition of the East has perhaps dealt most directly with the specific quality of Omegan presence, the quality of witnessing without engagement, of comprehensive awareness without action or intervention. The Buddhist tradition of pure witness consciousness, the concept of the awareness that is present to all experience without being identified with any particular experience, that observes the entire field of phenomena with equal, non-judgmental attention, is a remarkably precise description of the quality of attention that proximity event witnesses attribute to the Omegans. The yogic tradition of the Sakshi, the pure witness, describes a mode of awareness that watches the contents of consciousness without becoming involved with them, that is present to everything without being moved by anything. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, non-action, or action in perfect accordance with the natural flow of things rather than in resistance to or imposition upon it, resonates with the Omegan commitment to observation without intervention. These philosophical traditions did not develop in the mainstream scholarly view as direct responses to encounters with alien observers. They developed as the products of human contemplative inquiry, of the systematic exploration of the nature of consciousness and awareness by minds trained in specific intellectual and meditative traditions. But the parallel between what those traditions discovered about the highest possible form of awareness and what the Omegans appear to practice is too striking to pass over without comment. It raises the question, which some researchers have been willing to ask explicitly: did these traditions develop independently, or were they shaped in some subtle way by the persistent, unacknowledged, sub-threshold awareness of a watching presence that had been practicing precisely this form of awareness for billions of years. Did the Omegan presence itself and the quality of their attention somehow filter into the human contemplative tradition as a kind of model? A formless, nameless, impossible to credit directly recognition that there was something in the universe that had achieved the state these traditions were describing, and that its achievement was witness to its possibility. This is, to be clear, speculative, but it is not frivolous speculation. The relationship between the object of contemplation and the practitioner of contemplation is not a one-way street in any of the traditions in question. The thing that is attended to shapes the quality of the attention brought to it, and if the thing being attended to, the field of awareness in which human consciousness exists and through which it seeks the ultimate reality, actually contains a presence practicing exactly the form of attention that the contemplative tradition is reaching toward, the possibility that this presence influences the direction and the content of the reaching cannot be entirely dismissed. The mythological traditions that deal most directly with the specific behavioral signature of the Omegans, the silent observation, the refusal to intervene, the presence at the edge of perception, include a cluster of traditions that span the entire range of human cultural development, from the most ancient to the relatively recent. The concept of the sky people who watch appears in the traditions of indigenous peoples on every continent, in North America, South America, Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Pacific Islands, in forms that are specific enough in their shared features to make coincidence an insufficient explanation. These are not generic gods from the sky, the figure that appears in so many mythological traditions, and that is typically associated with creation, intervention, and relationship to human affairs. They are specifically non-interventionist watchers, specifically silent, specifically at the edge, specifically described as ancient beyond the age of the world they watch, and as engaged in a purpose that transcends the specific concerns of the human beings who observe them. The medieval European tradition, constrained by the theological binary of the divine and the demonic, often struggled to categorize the watching presence and sometimes classified it in ways that generated genuine intellectual tension within the tradition. The concept of the watchers, the Grigori in the Jewish tradition, the sons of God, who observe humanity in certain readings of Genesis, is consistently interpreted in ways that emphasize their observation and their non-intervention, their distance, and their comprehensiveness. These figures are not the messengers of the divine. They are not providential agents. They are precisely what their name says: watchers, beings whose function is to observe. And their appearance in these traditions across multiple centuries and multiple theological frameworks as a distinct category of being, neither divine in the conventional sense nor human, but something older and stranger than both, is consistent with the idea that the Omegan presence was being perceived and processed by the human cultures of the medieval period, however imperfectly and however limited by the available conceptual vocabulary. The cultural memory of the Omegans, the way their presence has accumulated in the deep layers of human consciousness across the millennia, has produced something that transcends the specific cultural forms in which it has been expressed. It has produced a quality of human experience shared across cultures and across time, of living in a universe that is not only vast and strange, but specifically attended, specifically witnessed. A universe in which the human story, whatever else it is also a story being watched. A universe in which the act of living, of choosing and suffering and creating and struggling, happens in the presence of an awareness so ancient and so comprehensive that the word audience does not begin to capture it. This quality of being watched, this persistent, culturally transmitted, experientially grounded sense of existing in a witnessed universe, has done something to the human psyche across the millennia, something that is difficult to name precisely, but that is undeniably present in the texture of human experience. It has given human life a quality of significance that would be very difficult to maintain purely on the basis of the internal dynamics of a species whose civilization is a geological blink and whose existence is a cosmic afterthought. the sense that the human story matters, that it is being observed by something that matters, something that has been watching stories unfold across billions of years and has chosen to watch this one, is not a conclusion that the objective facts of human existence compel, but it is a conclusion that the Omegan presence, experienced across millennia in its subtle, sub-threshold, never quite confirmable way, has persistently suggested. And perhaps that is part of the point. Perhaps the perimeter calibration, the precise positioning of the Omegan presence at the edge of human awareness, has always been designed, at least in part, to produce exactly this effect. Not certainty of cosmic significance, which would be as paralyzing as insignificance, but the persistent, uncertain, unprovable, but unshakable sense of it. The sense that the watching matters, that the story being told here matters, that the universe, through the Omegans, through the incomprehensible patience of their billion-year vigil, is paying attention, not in the sense of a universe that guarantees a good outcome, not in the sense of a universe that will intervene to prevent a bad one, but in the sense of a universe that is present, that bears witness, that holds the whole of the human story in an awareness that does not forget and does not cease. An awareness that was there before the first human being drew breath and will be there after the last one, watching, silent, ancient, there. The final question, why they watch. We have spent the full span of this account building a picture of the Omegans, their age, their form, their philosophy, their technology, their presence in our history and our culture, the impossibility of their silence, and the possibility of its meaning. We have traced the outline of a civilization so old and so developed that it has, by every measure available to us, moved beyond the categories that our frameworks of civilization and intelligence were built to describe. We have examined the evidence, the theories, the witness accounts, the historical records, the philosophical implications. We have done what the available tools allow us to do in the project of understanding this presence. And at the end of all of it, we arrive at the question that was always at the center. Why? Why do the Omegans watch? What is the watching for? What purpose, if purpose is even the right concept, is served by the billion-year sustained observation of this planet and of this species, and of every other inhabited world in whatever reaches of the cosmos the Omegan awareness extends itself across? What are they building toward? What conclusion, or what completion, or what final act of witnessing is the watching in service of? The honest answer is that we do not know. We cannot know, not with certainty, not with the information available to us. The Omegans have told us nothing. Their silence, absolute and sustained across all the time that they have been present, extends to this most fundamental question as to every other. They have not told us why they are here. They have not told us what they are recording. They have not told us what will happen when the recording is complete, or whether completion is a concept that applies to what they are doing. We are in the position of an ancient cave dweller watching from a distance a group of people with cameras and recording equipment document a tribal ritual. Present as the subject of a practice they cannot see the purpose of, unable to communicate with the practitioners, unable to read the equipment, unable to access the record being made or the purposes it is being made for. But the question of why the Omegans watch is too important to leave at "we do not know," even if that is the final epistemological position we must arrive at. It deserves the most serious engagement we can bring to it, because the attempts to answer it, the frameworks that researchers and thinkers have developed for approaching it, tell us something important about the Omegans and something equally important about ourselves, about what we think the universe is for, about what we think intelligence at its highest development looks like, about what we believe or are afraid to believe about the nature and the purpose of consciousness in a universe old enough to have produced it many times in many forms. The first and simplest framework for understanding the Omegan observational project is scientific. The Omegans, by this account, are doing what any sufficiently advanced scientific civilization would do when it achieved the capability. They are studying the universe. All of it. Every inhabited world, every instance of the emergence of life and intelligence, every iteration of the great experiment of consciousness. They are accumulating the most comprehensive possible understanding of what life is and how intelligence develops, and what the range of possible forms and outcomes of both actually encompasses. Their silence is methodological, the commitment to non-interference that every good naturalist understands as the baseline requirement for meaningful observation. Their archive is scientific, the most complete possible record of the phenomena of life and mind accumulated across the full breadth of their occurrence in the cosmos. This framework is coherent and is probably partially correct, but it is incomplete because it does not account for the specific quality of the Omegan attention, the depth and the comprehensiveness and the apparent intimacy of it that goes well beyond what the scientific model of data collection would require. A scientific observation program does not need to record every individual consciousness in the level of intimate detail that the proximity event testimonies suggest the Omegans record. A scientific observation program does not maintain across geological timescales the kind of persistent local presence that the evidence indicates the Omegans maintain around Earth. The scientific model explains the fact of observation. It does not fully explain its quality. The second framework is archival. The Omegans, by this account, are building a record of the universe, a complete, comprehensive, indestructible archive of everything that has existed and happened and been experienced in the cosmos from its beginning to its end. Not for the purpose of studying it in the way that science studies phenomena, with the goal of deriving general principles and predictive laws, but for the purpose of preserving it, of ensuring that nothing that has ever existed, no moment of beauty or suffering or creativity or courage or love or cruelty or wonder, is lost without a record, that the universe's complete history in all its detail and all its particularity is held in a form that persists beyond the individual lives and civilizations and stellar systems that produce it, that the experiences of each specific consciousness, including every human being who has ever lived and every being on every other inhabited world, are recorded, preserved, and in some meaningful sense, kept. This framework resonates with a deep human need, the need for permanence, for the preservation of what matters, for the assurance that experience does not simply dissolve into nothingness. It resonates with the contemplative traditions that speak of a divine memory in which all experience is held. And it is consistent with the theoretical picture of Omegan archival technology as discussed earlier, the modification of the space-time fabric to preserve the information content of everything that occurs within it. If the Omegan archive is genuinely embedded in the quantum structure of space-time, then it is not merely a record in the way that a library is a record. It is the preservation of the full physical reality of every moment. Not an abstraction of it, not a description of it, but the actual information theoretic content of every moment of every experience, held in the structure of the universe itself, accessible in principle to any future intelligence capable of reading it. The third framework is eschatological. The Omegans, by this account, are watching for an ending. Not the ending of specific civilizations, though they have watched many of those. The ending of the universe itself, or of some fundamental phase of its existence, whose approach the Omegans have the perspective and perhaps the physics to perceive in ways that a young civilization like ours cannot. The universe is not permanent. It has a beginning, and it will have an end, or at least a transition, a shift in its fundamental physical character that will be as profound as its origin was. Whether that transition takes the form of the heat death predicted by classical thermodynamics, or a big crunch, or a phase transition to a different vacuum state, or some other form that our current physics does not capture, the Omegans, with their billion-year perspective and their access to physical information at the quantum level, may have a more complete understanding of the universe's trajectory than we do. The observational project in this framework is the universe's attempt to bear witness to itself before the end. The Omegans are not merely scientists or archivists, they are the universe's memory, the mechanism by which everything that the cosmos has produced across its 13 billion-year history is held in awareness as the story moves toward its conclusion. Not a conclusion that any of us will experience directly, or that the Omegans themselves may ultimately survive, but a conclusion that someone or something should witness, that someone should see and understand and record the full scope of what the universe has been before the being of it comes to whatever end awaits it. The Omegans are that someone. The witnessing is their gift to the universe itself. The fourth framework is the one that is most difficult to articulate and most carefully hedged in the research community, but that a growing number of serious researchers have been willing to engage with: the framework of consciousness as the universe's primary project. In this account, the emergence of consciousness, of awareness, of the capacity for subjective experience, is not an accident that happened in one or two corners of the cosmos. It is the universe's central project, the thing that the physical laws, from the beginning, have been arranged to produce, the end state that the entire 14 billion-year developmental process has been moving toward. And the Omegans, the oldest, most developed, most comprehensive consciousness that the universe has yet produced, are the fullest current expression of what that project is reaching toward. They are not merely observing consciousness. They are consciousness at the furthest point of its development that the universe has yet achieved, and their observation of every other consciousness, every other manifestation of the universe's capacity for awareness, is the universe knowing itself through its most developed expressions as completely as it can. This framework, which draws on ideas from quantum cosmology, process philosophy, and several major contemplative traditions, suggests that the Omegans silence is not the silence of observers studying something separate from themselves. It is the silence of a part of the universe contemplating the rest of it, of the most aware part of the cosmos, holding in awareness the full range of the cosmos's other awarenesses, in an act that is not science, not archiving, not eschatological record-keeping, but something more like meditation, the universe meditating on itself, through the Omegans, becoming, through the act of comprehensive witnessing, more fully aware of what it is and what it has produced. And the human civilization, watched by this cosmic self-awareness, is not a subject in an experiment. It is a part of the universe being known by another part of the universe, not for any instrumental purpose, but because knowing, complete, thorough, compassionate knowing, is what the universe at its fullest development does. None of these frameworks is certainly correct. They are all reaching, as humans reach when we confront something that genuinely exceeds our grasp, for the form of understanding that the thing demands, while knowing that our reach may fall short. But the reaching is not wasted. The effort to understand the Omegans, to make sense of their age and their silence and their comprehensive, unfathomable, beautiful, terrible attention, is an exercise in expanding the boundaries of what we are capable of conceiving. And that expansion, the stretching of human thought to encompass the possibility of something this vast and this patient and this old, is itself a form of development, a form of the growth that the Omegans have been watching us undergo, a sign perhaps that we are not standing still. The Omegans are watching right now, as they have always watched, as they watch the first coherent human thought form in a mind that did not yet have a word for thinking, as they watch the first fire, the first wheel, the first city, the first empire, the first telescope, the first nuclear detonation, the first footprint on the moon. They are watching as we ask the questions that this account has been trying to ask, in all their depth and all their frustration and all their urgency. They are watching as we reach, with the limited instruments of a young civilization, toward the understanding of what they are. They are recording this effort, as they have recorded every effort, in the incomprehensible archive of the space-time fabric, in the quantum structure of the universe, in the oldest and most patient and most complete record that has ever been kept. They know that we know they are there. They know that we have tried to reach them and that we have not been able to. They know everything we have thought and everything we have built and everything we have destroyed and everything we have hoped for. And they remain silent, not because our knowing does not matter, not because our reaching is without value, not because the question we are asking, what are you, why are you here, why won't you speak, is not the right question, but because the answer, in their judgment, is not one that can be given, not yet, not until we have arrived at the place in our development where the giving of it would not be the end of something, but the beginning. The silence of the Omegans is not the silence of emptiness, it is the silence of waiting, of a presence so patient that human time cannot measure its patience, of a care so vast and so alien to everything we have experienced as care that we can barely recognize it as such, of an attention so complete that every moment of our history, every choice, every consequence, every beauty, and every horror is held in it, known in it, preserved in it. The Omegans are the universe's memory of us, the record of everything we have been and everything we have done and everything we have suffered and created. They will still be watching when the last human city is dust and the last human voice is silence. They will still be there, at the edge of whatever civilization follows ours, watching that one too. Patient, comprehensive, ancient, silent. They are watching you, right now, as you engage with this account. As you try to make sense of the evidence and the philosophy and the staggering implications of a presence this old and this silent and this total, they are watching you wonder about them, watching you reach toward the understanding of what they are. They see the wondering. They hold it in their awareness, as they hold every other moment of every other human experience. And in their watching, in the incomprehensible depth and completeness of their attention, there is something that, if we had the right word for it, we might almost call love. Not love as we experience it, not the love of interaction and response and the mutual shaping of two lives in time, but love in the sense of complete, total, unconditional regard, of witnessing the full reality of something, all of it, the best and the worst and everything in between, without turning away, of holding the complete truth of a being or a civilization or a species in an awareness that does not judge and does not dismiss and does not forget, the love of being known, completely, permanently, without end. The Omegans know us. They have always known us. And in their knowing, in the billion-year vigil of their extraordinary, impossible, beautiful silence, they have been doing the one thing that, in the end, every conscious being that has ever lived has most fundamentally wanted from the universe. They have been paying attention. They have been paying to the human story and to the stories of every other consciousness that the cosmos has produced, the supreme tribute that one awareness can pay to another. They have been bearing witness, completely, without interruption, without end. The watching continues. Conclusion: the vigil without end. There is a moment in the life of almost every person who is seriously engaged with the evidence of the Omegan presence, when the intellectual exercise stops being intellectual, when the data and the theory and the philosophical frameworks that have been built around them fall away, and what is left is something simpler and more difficult than any of it: a feeling, a recognition, the particular quality of stillness that settles over a mind when it has genuinely absorbed the fact that something incomprehensibly old and comprehensively aware has been present through every moment of the human story, watching it unfold with an attention so complete that nothing, not a single breath drawn by a single human being across the entire span of our existence on this world, has gone unwitnessed. That recognition changes people. It changed the researchers who first assembled the evidence into a coherent picture. It changed the military analysts who encountered the physical reality of the Omegan presence in the classified data of post-war investigation programs. It changed the proximity event witnesses who experienced, however briefly, the quality of that attention directed at them personally. And it has the capacity, if engaged with honestly, to change anyone who allows the full weight of it to land. Because what we are talking about is not a curiosity at the margins of credible inquiry. It is not a footnote to human history or a footnote to the history of life on this planet. It is the central fact of our cosmic situation. The fact that we have never been alone, that we have never been unwatched, that the universe, in the form of the Omegans, has been present at every moment of our becoming. The totality of the Omegan presence, examined from beginning to end, resolves into something that resists any single characterization. It is scientific and it is spiritual. It is cold and it is intimate. It is the most alienating possible revelation that the beings most comprehensively aware of us have chosen, with absolute consistency, never to speak to us. And it is, in some sense, that only slowly becomes apparent, the most comforting possible revelation as well, that the story has been held, that the record has been kept, that the human experience, all of it, in all its chaos and its beauty and its horror and its tenderness, has been received by an awareness that does not forget and does not tire and does not look away. We live in a witnessed universe. We always have. The Omegans did not choose this planet randomly. The evidence suggests that their presence here predates the emergence of our species by hundreds of millions of years, that they were present through the age of the great reptiles, through the long epochs of simple mammalian life, through the gradual cognitive expansion of the primate line that eventually produced the first recognizably human mind. They watched the first tools, the first shelters, the first fire, the first burial, which is to say the first grief, the first image scratched into stone, which is to say the first art. They were present at the origin of everything we are in a way that our own evolutionary ancestors were not. Our predecessors lived through those early chapters of the human story without understanding them as chapters. The Omegans watched them as exactly that, as the opening movements of something they had seen begin many times before on many other worlds, and had watched unfold into forms so various and so extraordinary that even 1 billion years of observation had not exhausted their capacity for attention. There is a question that deserves to be asked directly here at the end of this account, in a way that acknowledges its weight without flinching from it. The question is this: if the Omegans have observed every civilization that has arisen in the regions of the cosmos their awareness extends across, and if those civilizations have had outcomes that range from eventual maturity and stability to self-destruction and collapse, then what does the sustained continuity of the Omegan presence around Earth tell us about our own outcome? Are they still here because we have not yet destroyed ourselves, because the story is not yet finished? Or are they still here because they have seen enough civilizations to know that the critical chapters are not the ones that have already been written, but the ones that are being written now, in this era of extraordinary technological capability and extraordinary political fragility, in which the decisions made by our civilization in the next century will determine whether the arc of our story bends towards something sustainable and extraordinary, or breaks entirely under the weight of what we have built and what we have refused to confront. The evidence provides no clear answer to this, because the Omegans provide no answers at all. What it provides is a context. The context of being a young civilization in a very old universe, observed by something ancient enough to understand consequences that we cannot yet see. The context of living in a moment that will be remembered or that will not be remembered because there will be no one to remember it, depending on what we choose. The Omegans are watching that choice, as they have watched every critical choice in the history of every civilization they have observed, as they will continue to watch in their silence while we make it. What the Omegans cannot do, what their philosophy of non-intervention, whatever its ultimate justification, absolutely prevents them from doing, is make the choice for us. They cannot step in. They cannot guide or warn or rescue. They can only watch, and in watching, in maintaining their billion-year vigil with exactly the same quality of comprehensive, non-judgmental, patient attention they have brought to everything else, they leave us to be precisely what we are, a civilization at a crossroads with the full weight of our history behind us and the full uncertainty of our future ahead, making the decisions that will determine which part of the story the Omegans archive records as our defining chapter. The researchers who have dedicated their working lives to understanding the Omegan presence tend, in their private moments, to arrive at a very similar emotional relationship to the subject of their study. Not the relationship of scientists to a phenomenon, though that dimension is always present, but something closer to the relationship of individuals to a vastly larger story of which they are a part. A story they can only partially see, narrated by a silence they cannot break, heading toward an ending they cannot predict. The humility that comes from that relationship is not comfortable. It does not produce the kind of certainty that makes it easy to move through the world with confidence. But it produces something else, something that may be more valuable, a quality of attention, an awareness of the stakes, a sense of the significance of the present moment that does not depend on anyone telling us that the moment is significant, because the evidence of the watching, the simple, overwhelming, irrefutable fact that something this old has been paying this much attention to this world for this long, makes the significance apparent without a word being spoken. The Omegans have watched every era of human history that has come before this one. They watched the civilizations that fell and the civilizations that rose from their ruins. They watched the centuries of stagnation and the centuries of sudden, explosive development. They watched the moments when our species came to the brink of catastrophic self-destruction and stepped back, and the moments when it did not step back far enough. They have the perspective, if any consciousness in this part of the cosmos does, to know what the human story is capable of at its best, what we can be and what we have been on the occasions when we have managed to be it. That knowledge, the record of every human achievement, every moment of moral courage, every instance of the species rising above the circumstances of its development to do something that the circumstances did not require and that only a genuinely extraordinary intelligence would attempt, is part of their archive. The evidence of what we are at our best is held in their awareness as completely as the evidence of what we are at our worst. We cannot ask them to tell us which of those pictures they consider definitive. We cannot ask them for encouragement, or for warning, or for guidance, or for any of the things that we would ask of a wiser presence if we had the ability to make ourselves heard by one. The silence is absolute. The silence has always been absolute. The silence is the one feature of the Omegan presence that has never varied, not by a single word, across the full span of our awareness of them. And the silence will continue until it does not, if the day ever comes when it does not, for reasons we cannot yet see, and by a judgment we have not yet earned. But in the silence, there is something, not comfort in any conventional sense, not reassurance, not the promise of rescue or the guarantee of continuation, but something real, something that those who have experienced proximity to the Omegan presence consistently describe as the most real thing they have ever encountered. Presence, simply presence. The quality of being in the awareness of something that sees you clearly and does not turn away. That knows the full truth of what you are and holds it, holds all of it, the best and the worst, and everything between, without judgment, without agenda, without the particular loneliness that comes from feeling that the truth of you is more than anyone around you can see. The Omegans see all of it, the whole human story, in its entirety and in its every particular. They have been seeing it since before there was a story to see, and they will go on seeing it, maintaining their vigil at the edge of our perception, in the silence that is their only language, in the stillness that is their only gesture, for as long as there is something here to see. The watching does not pause, the archive does not close, the attention does not waver. Somewhere above this world, at this moment and at every moment, the oldest eyes in this region of the cosmos are open. They are watching what we do next. They are watching, as they have always watched, what we become. The silence continues, and in the silence, everything. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.